Kaizen-ro was given 9 days. In 9 days, his name would be struck from the Tyrant Academy's enrollment list, and his mother's debt would cease to be a debt. He would become a living obligation. A living obligation meant only one thing. House Lan would not take silver. House Lan would take a person. The debt was 900 marks. That was the cost of treating her lungs after the fall. Kaizen's mother's name was Seila-ro. For 8 years, she had carried other people's sacks down the stone chasms of the falls, and in her 9th year, she began coughing up black phlegm. The doctors pulled her back from the brink of death and sent the bill. The Tyrant Academy paid the bill in full. The Academy did this with every intake. It bought poor boys off the streets and put them on the transfer list. The condition was simple and well known to everyone. 3 marks in 9 days. 3 victories in the trials. If you didn't earn 3 marks, the contract would go to House Lan, along with you and the one you love. Kaizen knew the numbers by heart. He counted them all the way to the gates. The journey took 2 days on a salt merchant's wagon. The academy stood on a flat black rock above the city of Daen. The rock wasn't a rock. The rock was a lid. Beneath it lay the first abyss of this land, and the academy had been built on top of it like a lock on a chest. Kaizen saw the gates at dawn. The gates were made of dark iron, and 6 strips of different metals were embedded in them. The 6 strips signified 6 ranks: dust, tin, bone, steel, storm, crown. Ash was worn by those who were not yet worth anything. Tin was worn by those who had survived the first descent. Bone was awarded for continuous service in the abysses. Steel was given to only a select few. Storm occurred in this land twice per generation. Crown was never seen at all. Hanging above it all was the list. The list was a slab of white stone in the main courtyard, upon which 100 names were carved. The 100 best students of the academy. A place on the list granted a ration, a spot in the descent, and the right to speak to the mentors as equals. Everything else was dust beneath the list's feet. Kaizen entered the gates along with 42 other transfer students. They were lined up in the courtyard in front of the slab. They stood and looked at the 100 names that were strangers to them. Kaizen wasn't looking at the slab. Kaizen was looking at the people. He saw something no one else saw. Above each person, in his eyes, there was a line. The line was thin and gray and rested exactly above the eyebrow. The line contained a single word: rank. Not the rank a person wore on their collar, the real one. Kaizen called it the measure when he was 7 years old. That was when he first looked at the neighbor's blacksmith and saw the word bone above him. The blacksmith wore tin and considered himself tin his whole life. 2 years later, the blacksmith strangled a thief with his bare hands and was recruited into the city guard. Kaizen remained silent for 8 years. He remained silent because he understood a simple truth. A person who sees another's worth is worth more than anyone else he sees. And such a person is not taken as a friend. Such a person is bought. The measure operated on 2 levels. The upper layer was given for free. The upper layer showed a level and nothing more. The lower layer cost blood. If Kaizen looked deeply, his nose would bleed and a white haze would cloud his eyes. The lower layer revealed a crack. The crack was a weakness that would kill a person before their time. Sometimes it was an old bone. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was a single name that a person could not hear without distress. 3 deep gazes a day. After the 3rd, Kaizen was blind until morning. And there was one more thing. The gauge never revealed anything about him. He could look into water, into glass, and into the pupils of others. Nothing loomed over him. An empty space. The measurement was taken that same day. The new recruits were led in one by one into a circular hall with a gray stone column. The apprentice placed his palm on the stone, and the stone responded. It hummed dully on ashes. It rang on tin. It sang on bone. The column was rarely wrong, and so it was trusted like a priest. Kaizen placed his palm on the stone. The column made no sound. The scribe looked up and regarded him without interest. He recorded ashes and added the word dead in parentheses. Dead ashes was the designation given to those who lacked even a spark. There had been 9 such people in the last 6 intakes. Of those 9, none remained at the academy. Kaizen stepped out into the courtyard and heard laughter behind him. They weren't laughing at him. They were laughing simply because mocking dead ashes was a familiar and cheap pastime. He glanced over his shoulder at the column stone. There was no inscription above the stone. The stone was just a stone. That meant the column hadn't seen the truth. The column saw only what a person had already brought to the surface. Kaizen had no intention of bringing anything to the surface. The recruitment curator's name was Irdon K. He had ranked 2nd on the list for the 4th year in a row, and everyone knew why he wasn't first. First was Niera Sol, and no one could displace her. Irdon carried steel. In Kaizen's eyes, the word steel hovered over Irdon. Irdon was honest steel, and that was the worst of it. Irdon stepped out to the challengers and explained the rules without malice. 3 marks in 9 days. A mark is awarded for a victory in the qualifying round. The curator assigns the round. The curator chooses the opponent. Refusing a round counts as a loss. 2 losses in a single day deduct 1 day from the term. He said this matter-of-factly, and everyone understood that the term could be lost faster than it could be earned. Then Irdon walked along the line and stopped in front of Kaizen. He looked at the scribe's record. He said that a dead man's ashes had no place in the circle and that the academy would not waste space on him. He said he would give him the circle only once and on the very first evening. He said that would be fairer for everyone. The ranks were silent. Kaizen nodded. He knew how to nod. He'd been doing it for 8 years. That evening, they were assigned to the lower barracks. The lower barracks stood right at the edge of the cliff, and the wind blew through them on 3 sides. The barracks warden's name was Garn Lo. He was nearly 60 and walked sideways because his left hip had fused incorrectly after his 3rd descent. Garn Lo handed out blankets and bowls and didn't say a single unnecessary word. The word bone hung over Garn, a bone among the ashes. Kaizen looked at him twice and realized that the old man had been there longer than half the instructors. Kaizen sat down on his bunk and took out a letter. There was only 1 letter. His mother had written briefly because she'd paid someone else to write it for 2 coins. She wrote that her cough was gone. She wrote that she'd been given a job at the salt works and that she'd send as much as she could herself. She wrote that he shouldn't think about home. Kaizen folded the letter in 4 and tucked it under his shirt. His mother was lying about the salt works. The salt works in Den had closed last year. The first round was scheduled for sunset. The circle was not an arena. The circle was a hollowed-out section of rock 20 paces across with a smooth floor. Benches lined the edge for those on the list. Below, the ashes and tin crowded together. The arena coach was appointed as the judge. The coach's name was Marin Tuck. He was broad-shouldered and bald and held a short whip in his hand, though he never struck anyone with it. He would strike the stone with the whip when the round ended. Irdon personally chose Kaizen's opponent. The opponent's name was Tolvin Guess. Tolvin ranked 31st on the list and wore steel. He was a head taller and 2 poods heavier, and he walked across the stone the way people who are confident in their strength walk. The crowd understood everything in a single breath. Dead ashes against steel. This wasn't a round. It was a death warrant drawn up according to the rules. Tuk looked at Kaizen and asked if he wanted to withdraw. Refusal was considered a defeat, but it left one's ribs intact. Kaizen said he didn't want to. He stepped into the ring and, for the first time that day, looked deeply into his opponent's eyes. Blood began to flow immediately. It trickled thinly from his left nostril, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand. The crowd decided the boy was already trembling with fear. A second line formed over Tolvin Guess. A crack, his right knee, an old tear beneath the kneecap. Not a limp, not pain, just a joint that wouldn't bear his weight if he stood sideways on it under strain. Tolvin didn't know this himself. Tolvin only knew that he didn't like turning to the right. Kaizen lowered his arms. Tuk struck the stone with his whip, and the round began. Tolvin moved forward calmly. He had no intention of maiming the dust. He intended to knock him down once and finish it. Kaizen didn't dodge. Kaizen moved toward him and to the left. Tolvin had to turn to the right. He turned, shifted his weight, and his knee veered slightly to the side. Tolvin didn't notice. Kaizen did. The second attack was the same. The third, too. Kaizen didn't strike. Kaizen moved counterclockwise in a circle, forcing the steel apprentice to turn in one direction over and over again. The crowd began to whistle. The whistling was bored. Tuk stopped watching the fighters and started looking at their feet. He had been a coach for 20 years, and he was the first in the stands to realize what was happening. On the ninth turn, Tolvin picked up speed. He lost his patience and lunged forward, and at the very end of the movement, he planted his right foot sideways with his full weight. His knee buckled. Tolvin fell onto his side, and as he fell, Kaizen reached out his hand for the first time in the entire round. He didn't strike him in the face. He grabbed the steel apprentice by the wrist, twisted him downward toward the stone, and sat on top of him with all his weight. Tolvin was stronger. Tolvin couldn't stand on his right leg. He tried twice, and on the second attempt, he screamed through clenched teeth. Tuk struck the stone with his whip. The round was over. Silence fell over the hollow. The silence lasted 4 or 5 heartbeats, and they were the longest heartbeats of Kaizen's life. Then someone in the upper row said the knee was old. Then they said the dust was just swirling and that the steel apprentice had been unlucky. And so the silence closed in. Kaizen stood up and wiped his face. The blood on his palm was already dried and brown. He had received his first mark. He received it at sunset on the first of 9 days. Tuk approached him as the crowd dispersed. The coach looked him in the eyes for a long time, and Kaizen held his gaze. Marin asked how long he had known about the knee. Kaizen said he'd noticed how Tolvin placed his foot as he walked across the courtyard. It was a lie, and Tuk accepted it. He said that in 20 years, he'd seen 3 people who knew how to watch their feet. He said that 2 of them were now leading the descents. He said where the third one was, and that was something Kaizen preferred not to hear. Then the coach stepped away, and Kaizen saw his face from the side. Tuk's face didn't look like that of a referee. It looked like that of a man who had just done some calculations and realized the numbers didn't add up by a large amount. The mark was recorded in the book an hour later. An hour and a half later, it was crossed out. Earden K did it himself, openly, in front of 3 witnesses. He announced that fighter Rowe had applied a hold on his fallen opponent after the opponent had lost his footing. He announced that this was a violation of the 3rd clause of the qualifying rules. He announced that the mark was being removed and that 2 days would be deducted for the violation. He added that the offender would lose another day for arguing. Kaizen looked at the book. Tolvin Guess's entry listed a loss due to injury. That meant the Academy had acknowledged that the steel apprentice had lost, and at the same time, it had acknowledged that the victor hadn't actually won. Kaizen recalculated. He had 6 days left and 0 marks. In a single evening, he'd lost a third of his time and gained an enemy ranked second on the list. He didn't say a word. He left the library and stopped in the dark hallway, standing there until his hands stopped shaking. A messenger found him in the hallway. The messenger said they were waiting for him in the upper wing, and they were waiting right now. The upper wing was where the magisters lived. The powdered ones were never taken there. Kaizen walked upstairs, counting the steps instead of thinking. He counted 84. The door was open. A man in gray sat at a table, sorting through draft papers. His name was Soren Teed, and he was the magister of allocation. The assignment office decided who would go to which descent and who would return. Soren looked up and smiled the way one smiles at a good acquaintance. He said he'd seen the circle from the top bench. He said a boy was worth more than ashes. He said he was ready to give him 2 marks tomorrow without any circle. He placed a sheet of paper with the text already written on it on the table and said that all that was needed was a signature. Kaizen took the sheet. The text was short. It transferred all future marks and all future positions on the list to the disposal of the assignment department for 9 years. Kaizen looked up to read the master's expression, and then he saw the line above Soren Teed. The line was in its proper place, even and clear. It contained a single word: crown. No one in this region had worn a crown for 200 years. And beneath the first line was a second one that never appears. It wasn't gray. It was red. The red line hovered steadily above Soren Teed, without flickering. Kaizen stared at it, realizing he couldn't read it. It consisted of symbols, not words. The symbols were packed tightly together like stitches, and for the first time in 8 years, the measure was presenting him with an image he couldn't decipher. The back of his head grew hot. Blood began to flow from both nostrils at once and dripped onto the sheet of paper containing the contract. Soren Teed raised an eyebrow and pushed a handkerchief toward him. He said that translators often get a runny nose from the altitude. He said the cliff stood in thin air. Kaizen took the handkerchief and lowered his face, and at that moment a white haze completely obscured his vision. He went blind on his second look of the day, not his third. He had never gone blind on his second look before. That meant the red line was more valuable than an ordinary crack. He stood with the handkerchief pressed to his face and listened. Soren Teed spoke calmly and to the point. He said that the academy was not a poorhouse. He said that silver had been paid for every transfer student and that the silver must be repaid. He said that signing the contract was not slavery, but simple clarity. Kaizen listened to the voice and thought otherwise. The master of allocation wore a bone on his collar. The bone was the most ordinary rank for a mid-level instructor, but his true rank was the crown. The man with the crown sat in the paper room and signed orders for descents. Such a thing didn't happen without a reason. There were 2 possible reasons. Either Soren was hiding, or Soren was keeping watch. Kaizen returned the handkerchief and said he would think it over until morning. Soren Teed did not press the issue. He said the offer was good until noon, and that after noon it would be worth nothing. He said this kindly, and that kindness made the back of Kaizen's neck cramp up. He went out and made his way down the 84 steps, holding onto the wall. He could see only bright spots. At the bottom, Garn Lo grabbed him by the shoulder. The old man led him sideways and in silence to the barracks, sat him down on a bunk, and placed a mug of hot water next to him. He said he'd seen others like him before. He said that with all of them, the blood comes first, and then everything else follows. Kaizen asked what everything else meant. Garn Lo didn't answer. He went to extinguish the lamps. His vision didn't return until 3 o'clock in the morning. Kaizen lay there staring at the ceiling and counting. 6 days. 0 marks. Irdan K assigns the circles and might not assign a single one. Soren Teed gives 2 marks at once and takes 9 years for it. Both options led in the same direction, and the only difference was who exactly would apply the brand. In the morning, there were fewer options. At dawn, a clerk came to the barracks and read out the order. The order wasn't for a circuit, it was for a descent. The first abyss was opened on the 4th day of every week, and porters were led there. A porter would descend with an empty crate and ascend with a full one. Porters were taken from the ashes and the tin and from those who had no choice. They were paid half a mark for each descent. Half. That meant 2 descents earned 1 mark, and 6 days' work theoretically earned 3. Kaizen understood this, and he immediately understood a second thing. No one survives 3 descents in a row without a step. His name was listed 3rd on the roster. First on the roster was Garn Lo. The old man had been leading porters for 12 years, and they put him on every roster because he was the only one who ever brought people back. Kaizen looked at him across the courtyard. A bone hovered over Garn Lo. Kaizen looked deeply. Blood flowed heavily and slowly, and the world swayed. A second line unfurled above the old man. A crack. The left lung. Kaizen stared at this line and couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. Then he understood. The line wasn't gray. It was dull, like cooling coal. He had never seen a dull crack before. The descent began at noon. The rock cover was opened by a gate manned by 8 men. Beneath the cover was a stone passageway winding downward in a wide spiral. The walls of the passageway were dry and warm, and the warmth came from below. There were 9 porters and 2 apprentices with weapons, and Garn Lo with a whistle. There was one rule, and the old man repeated it twice. Walk along the outer wall. Do not touch the center. When you hear the whistle, lie down and do not move. Kaizen walked forth and watched his step. On the 200th turn of the spiral, bones began to appear. The bones lay near the inner edge and had been gnawed clean. Neatly meant not with teeth. On the 300th turn, the throat opened into a basin. Pillars of white stone rose from the basin, and between the pillars lay crates from previous descents. The cargo was called vein. The vein was a light-colored resin that accumulated in the cracks of the basin and was distilled at the top for lamps and medicines. The chasm yielded the vein and, in return, took people. The porters worked in silence. Kaizen filled a crate and lifted it, and his back immediately seized up. He looked up at the coils of the spiral and realized he wouldn't be able to carry it all the way. And at that moment, Garn Lo whistled. Everyone lay down. Kaizen lay down too and turned his head. A creature was moving between the pillars. It was long and low to the ground, moving silently on 6 jointed legs. It had no head. In place of a head was a flat, fringed bone shield. The creature was called a silent walker, and everyone who descended knew it. The silent walker did not see those lying down. The silent walker saw movement. It passed 6 paces from Kaizen, and Kaizen looked at it out of habit. There was no inscription above the creature. The measure saw only people. The quiet walker reached the far edge of the basin and stopped. And then one of the porters couldn't take it anymore. It was a boy made of tin on his first descent, and he jumped up and ran toward the throat. The creature turned around faster than it took him to take his 3rd step. After that, Kaizen saw everything torn to pieces. A scream. The whistle blew a second time, right on top of the first. 2 students with spears stepped into the passageway. Garn Lo was heading not toward the throat, but toward the creature. The old man walked sideways, covering his hip, and in his hand he held a short harpoon on a chain. He threw the harpoon from below upward under the shield, hitting the soft spot, and the chain snapped taut. The creature jerked its shield, and the old man was knocked off his feet and dragged across the stone. The students struck it in the side with their spears, and the creature spun around to face them. Garn Lo dropped to one knee, wound the chain around his forearm, and braced himself. He held it just long enough for the spears to strike a second time. The slow walker twitched one last time and fell. Garn Lo lay down as well. The chain had torn the skin from his arm down to the bone, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was in his chest. The creature's shield had grazed him and driven a rib inward. Kaizen crawled over first. The old man was breathing rapidly and shallowly, and air was bubbling out from beneath his right collarbone. Kaizen looked at the line above him. The dim crack now glowed brightly and evenly, like an open furnace. The left lung. It was still beating right now. He knew what to do because he'd seen it with his mother. He tore off his shirt, rolled it up, and pressed it against the hole under the collarbone with all his weight, holding it there. He kept it that way until the students dragged the box over and laid the old man on it. The climb took 4 hours. Garn Lo spoke only once, halfway up the spiral. He said the boy was holding it correctly. He said he needed to press harder. He said there was a 12-year-old duty logbook in his closet under the second shelf, and that it would be more useful to the boy than to him. Kaizen asked why he needed the duty logbook. Garn Lo said it recorded who went where and who didn't return from where. He said the academy kept 2 books. He said no one read the second book because it was boring. Then he fell silent. Once they reached the top, they carried him to the infirmary. By evening, a clerk came and struck his name from the duty roster. By nightfall, Garn Lo had died. Kaizen learned about this from the janitor and went to the infirmary, but they wouldn't let him in. He stood outside the door and heard them rearranging the cot inside for the next patient. He stood there until 2 o'clock, and that's when everything else became clear to him. It didn't start as pain. It started as a chill in his eye sockets. Kaizen sank to the floor of the hallway, pressed his palms against his face, and saw light shining through them. The lines above the people in his head unfolded all at once and grew longer. He saw the hallway empty. He saw the infirmary through the wall. He saw 7 people there, and above each one stood not 2 lines, but 4. A step, a crack, and 2 more that hadn't been there before. The third line was called vitality. Not the kind of vitality carried in crates, a different kind. Vitality was what a person was naturally capable of, and what they themselves were most often unaware of. Above the doctor stood the vitality of a firm hand. Above the boy with the burn stood the vitality of counting steps. Above the woman by the window stood the vein of another's pain. The 4th line was shorter than all the others, and Kaizen looked at it the longest. The ceiling. The ceiling was the limit. It didn't show who a person was. It showed how far a person could grow if they lived long enough and didn't break. A tin ceiling hung over the doctor. The doctor was 40, and he had already hit his limit 10 years ago. A steel ceiling hung over the boy with the burn. Kaizen lowered his hands and looked at his palms. His palms were covered in blood, and the blood wasn't coming from his nose. It was streaming from his eyes in 2 thin trails down his cheekbones. And then, for the first time in his life, a line lit up above him. It didn't appear above his eyebrow. It appeared inside his head, and he read it as one reads one's own thoughts. Ceiling. Storm. And the word storm had an edge. The edge was gnawed away by a third, like a coin that had been filed down. Kaizen looked at that edge and merged 2 things into one. He looked deeply 7 times over the course of the day. He should have gone blind after the 3rd time. He did not go blind. Instead, his own ceiling grew shorter. The measure took its toll not with blood. Blood was the change. The measure took its toll with his limit. Every deep gaze cut away a piece of who Kaizen could have become. He sat on the floor of the infirmary corridor and counted for the third time in 2 days. 6 days remained until the end of his term. 0 marks. 1 storm with a nod-away edge, and 900 marks in debt that hadn't gone anywhere. He got up and walked to the barracks, and on the way he realized that he now had an answer to Soren Teed's offer. Soren was buying his future for 2 marks. Soren didn't know that the future was already being spent on its own, and that every glance was worth more than any signature, so he couldn't sell anything. So he had to look only where a glance paid off. In the barracks, Kaizen found Garn Lo's cabinet. The second panel came off easily. The duty roster lay beneath it, wrapped in canvas. It was thick and swollen from dampness, and it contained 12 years' worth of duty schedules. Kaizen opened it to the last page and began reading from the bottom up. He read the names and dates, not realizing what he was looking for. He figured it out on the 4th page. The book contained all the descents, and next to each descent, on the side, was a note in someone else's handwriting. The note consisted of a single letter and a number. Next to the names of those who hadn't returned, there was most often a letter paired with the same number. Kaizen flipped back 2 years. The pattern remained the same. He flipped back 5 years. The pattern remained the same there, too. People weren't assigned to missions by chance. Someone was arranging them in advance. He closed the book and sat down on his bunk, and at that moment 2 senior officers from the list entered the barracks. They had come for the book. They didn't know he'd already found it. They'd simply come to clear out the late caretaker's closet, as they always did. Kaizen shoved the book under his blanket, sat on top of it, and looked at the newcomers through the top layer. Tin and bone. Then he looked deeply at the second one. Blood flowed from his left eye. A third line unfolded above the senior. A vein, a stranger's castle. And the fourth, a ceiling of dust. The student of the Tyran Academy, one of the 100 names of list, had a ceiling of dust. He was already standing above his limit. He stood there not because he was growing. He stood there because he had been placed there. And that meant that List was lying. Kaizen looked at the line and heard the wind rustling in the corridor. He realized he hadn't found a book. He had found the beginning of a tally, and that tally had been kept against him even before he entered the gates. The book had been tucked under Kaizen's shirt all night, and by morning it was damp from his own sweat. The 2 senior officers left empty-handed and recorded the cabinet as empty. This gave Kaizen exactly as much time as he needed to solve one problem. The problem wasn't about the book. The problem was about 6 days and 0 marks. He sat on the edge of his bunk before dawn and laid out everything he had. He had 4 lines for each person. He had a ceiling of thunder gnawed away by a third. He had a book he couldn't show to anyone. And he had a supervisor who wouldn't give him a single more circle. The last one was the most important. Earden K wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a thief. Earden K simply kept things the way they'd always been. Dead ashes must not triumph over steel. If that happened, it meant the rules had been broken. Earden sincerely believed this, and that's why he was more dangerous than any villain. Kaizen stood up and went to look for a loophole. He found the loophole in the selection rules that Earden himself had read aloud to the ranks. The curator assigns the round. The curator chooses the opponent. But there was a third clause, and it hadn't been read aloud because they never used it. A selection round could be set up as a pair, 2 against 2. Such a round was assigned not by the curator, but by the arena supervisor. The arena supervisor was Marin Tuck. Pair rounds had been abolished 6 years ago, not by order, but by custom. They weren't assigned because no one asked for them. Kaizen went to Marin Tuck immediately after the morning roll call. The coach was chewing on a cracker and staring at an empty spot. Kaizen asked for a paired round. Marin Tuck said that a paired round meant half a mark for each person. Kaizen said he knew that. He said he needed 4 halves, and that 4 halves would give him 2 marks, and he'd take the third however it turned out. Marin Tuck stopped chewing. He said that for a paired round, Earden would flay the arena manager. Kaizen said the rule was on the record. Marin Tuck said that a rule on paper and a rule in practice were 2 different things. Then he looked at the ring again and said he'd grant 1 paired round. 1. Tonight. And that Kaizen would find his own partner. And that if the partner were from the ashes, the opponents would be made of tin instead of steel. And that was the only concession he could afford to make without explanation. Kaizen went out into the courtyard to look for a partner and realized just how bad things were. There were 42 transfers. None of them would step into the ring with a dead soul whose time was up in 6 days. To stand beside a doomed soul was to put oneself on the list of the doomed. He knew that. So he didn't go to the transfer students. He went where the people had already been written off. The service building stood below the barracks and housed the storage rooms and furnaces. Those who worked there were the ones the academy hadn't expelled simply because someone had to haul coal. Kaizen walked past the furnaces, glancing at the top layer. Ash, ash, tin, ash. And at the 4th furnace, he stopped. Standing by the furnace was a guy as huge as a gate and as slow as water. He was shoveling slag with a wide shovel, doing it steadily and without stopping for who knows how many hours. Above him stood a step of dust. Above him stood a vein of anchor. And above him stood a ceiling of storm. A storm amid the coal dust. Kaizen approached and introduced himself. The guy's name was Vigo Tan. He wasn't surprised or pleased. He said he'd been kicked out of the combat program in his 2nd month for failing to land a single strike. He said the coach had called him a bag. He said this calmly, as if talking about the weather. Kaizen asked if he could take a punch while standing still. Vigo Tan said he could. He said no one had ever been able to knock him down, and that no one needed to anyway because fighting is all about movement. Kaizen said that fighting isn't just about movement. He said he needed 1 evening and half a mark. Vigo Tan looked down at him and asked why he needed that. Kaizen answered honestly. He said he had 6 days, and that after 6 days, the land house would take him away. Vigo Tan nodded and leaned his shovel against the wall. He said he'd come. Kaizen found the 2nd person an hour later without even looking for him. He stepped out of the utility building and realized the drawstring on his wallet was missing. The wallet was empty, but the drawstring was new. He turned around and saw a back. The back was disappearing around the corner smoothly and without haste, and that was skill, not luck. Kaizen followed. There was no one around the corner. He looked up. A skinny guy was sitting on the ledge of the 2nd story, examining the drawstring in the light. A tin step stood above the guy. A living shadow of a step stood above him. A steel ceiling stood above him. Kaizen said the cord was worth half a mark and that he was willing to trade it for half a mark. The guy dangled his legs and asked who he was. Kaizen introduced himself. The guy said his name was Ocean Kerr and that he wasn't a student but a former student, and that he'd been expelled during the last intake for his 3rd theft. He said he lived on the cliff because he had nowhere else to go, and that he didn't need a tag because no one would accept him anywhere. Kaizen said that the tag provided rations for 9 days. Ocean Kerr paused and jumped down. He said that rations were a different matter. The match was scheduled for sunset. The opponents were cast from tin, just as Marin Tuck had promised. Their names were Darren Val and Tolvin Gass. When Kaizen heard the 2nd name, He realized that the coach hadn't been helping him. The coach had checked. Tolvin Guess was made of steel, but after a knee injury, he'd been temporarily demoted to the tin list. He stepped into the ring with a tight bandage and a completely expressionless face. He wasn't out for revenge. He was out to reclaim his name. Kaizen looked deeply at the pair. One glance. Blood from his right eye. Darren Val had a head start. He could see the fight 2 steps ahead, which was why they'd kept him on the tin list for 6 years, even though his ceiling was bone. Tolvin Guess's fracture remained the same, and the knee under the bandage hadn't healed. But a second problem had arisen. He was now afraid to turn to the right, and he knew he was afraid. The fear was worse than the injured joint because it prevented him from moving in either direction. Kaizen assessed the situation and gave 2 orders. To Vigo Tanu, he said to stand. Just stand there. Don't strike. Take whatever comes and don't move a muscle. To Ocean Kura, he said not to come within 4 steps of them and to stay behind Darren Val at all times. Ocean asked what to do once he got there. Kaizen said nothing. Just be there. Marin Took struck a rock with his whip. Darren Val started off on the right foot. He led Tolvin forward toward Vigo, and himself went around to flank Kaizen. Vigo Tan took the Steel Disciple's blow to the chest and didn't budge. Tolvin struck a second time, then a third, and on the third strike, his foot slipped. He shifted his weight backward and hesitated to turn around. Darren Val reached Kaizen and lost his balance mid-movement. He lost his balance because standing behind his shoulder was a man he couldn't see and couldn't anticipate. Darren's instincts kept him 2 steps ahead. Ocean Kerr didn't take any steps at all. He simply moved and found himself where he hadn't been a moment before. After 4 exchanges, Darren Val began to turn around. He turned once, then twice. On the third turn, Kaizen rammed him with his shoulder, knocked him onto the stone, and held him by the collar. Tolvin Guess was left alone against a wall named Vigo Tan. He struck 8 more times. Vigo stood his ground. On the 9th strike, Tolvin lowered his arms of his own accord, stepped back, and said he wouldn't break his knee a second time for a tin circle. Marin Tuck struck the stone with his whip. Silence fell over the arena once more. This time, the silence lasted longer and felt different. The crowd didn't understand what they had just witnessed. No one here had displayed either strength or speed. Here, 3 men had done 3 very mundane things and won. Kaizen received half a mark. Vigo Tan received half a mark, and for the first time in 2 years, his last name appeared on the lists of the maintenance corps. Ocean Kerr received a 9-day ration and nothing more because he had been expelled. He said that was enough. Everything that followed was work and took 3 days. Kaizen didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He just did it. On the first evening, he and Vigo Tan went out to the empty excavation site after lights out, and Kaizen would position him in the same corner and throw a sandbag at him until his own arms gave out. Vigo didn't budge once, and by the second evening, he was catching the bag before it even touched him. On the second day, Kaizen dragged Ocean Kerr out onto the ledges and made him walk behind the unsuspecting seniors across the courtyard and back. Ocean slipped twice and nearly broke his ankle once, but on the third try, he made it across the entire courtyard without even Marin Tuck noticing him. On the third night, the 3 of them sat in the utility building by the cooling stove, and Kaizen laid out a diagram of the heist, drawn in charcoal, in front of them and explained a simple truth. He said that strength alone doesn't win the game. The one who wins is the one who knows in advance where the opponent will falter. Vago asked how he knew that. Kaizen said he looked at the legs and the shoulders. Ocean glanced at him sideways and didn't ask anything at all. He was a thief, and he knew better than to ask questions about someone else's craft. By the morning of the 4th day, Kaizen had 1.5 marks and a 1.5 day head start. And that was when he felt for the first time that the price was rising. He looked deeply into Vago Tan's eyes to check if a nerve had shifted under the strain. Blood gushed from both eyes at once. Inside his head, the line marking his own limit trembled, and the word storm was gnawed away a little more. Now it was almost half gone. Kaizen sat down right on the floor by the stove and stayed there for a minute. He recalculated, and the tally was unpleasant. In 4 days, he'd spent more of his limit than in the past 8 years combined. He looked at Vago and Ocean. Vago Tan could grow to reach Thunderstorm if he lived long enough. Ocean Kerr could reach Steel. Kaizen himself could never reach Thunderstorm anymore. He was giving away his ceiling in chunks just to see others' ceilings. And that would have been a fair trade if anyone besides him had known about it. The second paired round was scheduled for the 5th day, and it wasn't Marin Took who scheduled it this time. It was scheduled by Erden K himself. This was the curator's first real mistake. Erden noticed that the transfer student was racking up marks by cutting corners and decided to plug the hole with his own system. He pitted a pair from the list against them, the 39th and 44th ranked students. Both stood their ground. He announced this before the entire court and added that the rule regarding paired rounds was indeed on record and that the academy would not hide behind old habits. He said this honestly. He believed what he was saying. Kaizen looked at the pair and gave them another deep, penetrating gaze. The first of the two had a crack in his breathing. He held his breath too long on the swing, and after the 6th swing, his shoulders slumped. The second steel had almost no cracks. The second had a narrow streak in his line, and Kaizen read it only on the 3rd try. There was a name there. Irdon. The second steel feared his mentor more than any opponent. Kaizen put together a plan in half a night. He told Vago Tan to stand as usual and hold the first one until the 7th swing. He told Ocean Kerr not to touch the second one at all. He told him to do something else. He told him to walk to the edge of the circle and position himself so that Erden K would be right behind him, within the second steel's line of sight. Ocean asked why. Kaizen said that a man who fears his commander cannot strike in his direction. The circle was short. Vago Tan took the first strike and held firm until the 7th swing, and on the 8th, the steel fighter dropped his arms and gasped for breath. The second steel fighter started strongly and confidently, and after 10 steps reached the line where Ocean's own mentor stood behind him. He hesitated. He hesitated for a quarter of a breath. Kaizen stepped into that quarter of a breath, knocked out his supporting leg, and pinned him against the stone. The whip struck the stone. The courtyard was silent. Erden K stood at the edge of the pit, his face pale and very calm. Kaizen had earned his 2nd mark in full. 1 mark remained, and a day and a half. Marin Took caught up with him in the passageway and spoke for the first time in all this while, not as a judge. He said that for 20 years he had set the rings and seen it all. He said that over the past few days he'd seen something new. He said the boy was winning not through combat, but through his choice of position. He said that wasn't how students fought. That's how those who lead the descents fought. Then he fell silent and added more quietly that if that were true, the boy wouldn't be allowed to live to see the 3rd mark. Kaizen asked why. Marin Took said that the academy didn't like those who could see the formation. He said that the last one like that was named Garn Lo, and that he'd been kept as a barracks guard for 12 years. Kaizen stood there listening and realized that the old man with the broken hip hadn't been a guard. The old man was taken away. By evening on the 5th day, a rumor spread through the courtyard. The rumor was brief and therefore spread quickly. People said that the dead man's ashes had earned 2 marks in 3 days, and that he was doing this with a coalman and an expelled thief. The rumor reached even the upper shops. And then Niera Sol came down into the courtyard. She had been ranked first on the list for 4 years. She wore steel on her collar. Kaizen looked at her through his upper layer and saw the steel plate. He looked again because he couldn't believe it. The plate was real and matched the collar. For the first time in all his years at the Tyrant Academy, a person turned out to be exactly who they were listed as. Niera Sol approached and looked at Kaizen, at Vigo Tan, and at Ocean Kerr, who was sitting on the ledge. She said she wanted to watch his third circle. She said she would come in person. She said this without a threat. She left, and Kaizen remained standing, trying to comprehend what had actually happened. Until today, he had been trash, and no one touches trash. Now the number 1 on the list was watching him, which meant everyone who watched her was watching him too. That night, a messenger from Soren Teed arrived at the barracks. The offer had been dead since noon on the first day, and Soren hadn't revived it. The messenger brought something else. He brought a slip of paper with the name of the 3rd round. Kaizen's 3rd round had already been assigned from above, not through the curator and not through the platform. The round was scheduled for tomorrow. There was only one opponent, Erden K. Kaizen held on to the sheet listing the name of the 3rd round until 3 in the morning. The paper was official and bore 2 seals, the venue seal and the allocation department seal. The venue seal meant the round was legitimate. The allocation department seal meant the round had been ordered from above and that Marin Took wouldn't cancel it even if she wanted to. At the bottom of the sheet, a condition was noted. A round with the recruitment supervisor counts for full points. A victory earns a point. A defeat wipes out all accumulated points at once. Kaizen read that line 4 times. His 2 points were now worth exactly as much as a single evening. He placed the sheet on his bunk and went out into the courtyard. The night was dry and the scent of salt drifted in from the sea. He sat down on the bottom step of the staircase and began to think about what he didn't have. He didn't have a step. He didn't have strength. He didn't even have a whole ceiling because the word storm inside his head had been gnawed away almost to the middle. He had 4 deep gazes left until morning, and each one cut off another piece. So he had to look just once, and he had to look precisely. He got up and went to wake Ocean Kerr. What followed were 3 days compressed into a single night. Ocean Kerr didn't ask why and went straight up to the rooftops. He returned 2 hours later and brought 3 things. He said that Erden K doesn't sleep in front of the circles and walks along the upper gallery all night. He said that Erden walks only on the left side of the gallery and never on the right. He said that in the curator's room, a short spear with a wrapped shaft hangs on the wall, and that the spear belongs to someone else and doesn't fit his hand. Ocean's second trip was to the library, from which he brought back not a piece of paper, but a scent. He said that the lamps in the hall were burning with the highest grade wicks, and that such lamps were supplied only to the distribution department. This meant the library wasn't located beneath the platform. It was beneath Soren Teed. The third clue came from Vigo Tan. The coalman had worked by the furnaces for 2 years and knew everyone who carried coal upstairs. He brought an old woman to the furnace who stoked the galleries. The old woman said she remembered the younger K. She said the younger one was quieter than the older one, and that he had been taken down the year the second horizon was opened. She said the younger one's name was Talik, and that it was inscribed on the stone by the eastern wall along with 42 others. Kaizen asked how many people had gone on that descent. The old woman said 60 had gone, and 17 had returned. Kaizen returned to the barracks, took out Garnlow's book, and found that year. The descent to the second horizon took up 4 pages. Next to the name Talik K was that very same mark. A letter and a number, the same one as next to everyone who hadn't returned. Kaizen closed the book and sat with it on his lap until dawn. He now knew where Irdan K's crack was, and he understood it more deeply than the measure would have revealed. He could have spoken that name aloud in the middle of the circle, and the curator would have broken down on the spot in front of everyone. He imagined it and realized he wouldn't do it. Not out of pity, out of calculation. A man broken before the eyes of the court becomes an enemy forever. A man who loses by his own rules becomes something else. Kaizen didn't yet know what, but the latter was more valuable. The circle was scheduled for noon. Noon was a bad time, and it wasn't chosen by accident. At noon, the pit was exposed to the sun, and the stone radiated heat into their faces. More people had gathered than at any selection in recent years. The upper benches had arrived. The scribes had arrived. Niera Sol arrived, sat on the edge, and spoke to no one. Marintuk stepped into the center and announced the conditions loudly and to the letter. A circle with a curator. Full count. The one summoned chooses the circle's form. Kaisan said he was choosing the until surrender circle. The crowd murmured. The until surrender circle was the longest and hardest, and the winner was the one with the most endurance. Against steel, dust had no endurance. Irdan K heard the choice, and his expression didn't change. He took off his outer jacket, folded it neatly, and handed it to the scribe. He did everything carefully because neatness was his way of life. Kaizen looked at him intently. Just once. Blood streamed immediately from both eyes, and he made no move to wipe it away. The crowd saw the red streaks on his cheekbones and decided the boy was already broken. 4 lines stood above Irdan K. The step was steel. The rhythm was an even stride. The ceiling was steel. He was already at his limit and stood there honestly, which is why he was second on the list and would never be first. And a crack. The crack was neither in his me nor in his breath. The crack was a single line, and in it was the word order. Kaizen looked at that word and put the last piece in place. Irdan K could not break the rule. He didn't want to. He couldn't. Order had kept him on his feet after that descent, and without order, he wouldn't have been able to stand at all. So for Irdan, the rule wasn't a law. It was a bone. Marintuk struck the stone with his whip. Irdan stepped forward smoothly and without a wind-up. He struck once at the torso, and Kaizen stepped aside, deflecting half the force, yet still lost his breath. The second blow landed on the shoulder and spun him around. The third knocked him off his feet. Kaizen got back up. He didn't strike back even once. He just kept getting back up. It went on for a long time and was very boring to watch. At first, the crowd cheered. Then they fell silent. Irdan knocked him down 9 times, and on the 10th, he stopped of his own accord and told the referee over his shoulder that the fighter couldn't continue. Marintuk said that the fighter hadn't given up and that the round would continue until he did. Irdan nodded and knocked him down for the 11th time. And that's when Kaizen started to make his move. He stopped getting up right away. He began to get up slowly, and each time he ended up half a step to the left of where he'd been before. Irdan circled after him, approaching from the left because he'd spent his whole life walking on the left, and walking on the left in the gallery. And it wasn't a habit, but a scar. Kaizen led him to the left, turn after turn, shifting toward the very edge of the recess where the rock rose up as a wall. On the 17th fall, he lay with his back directly against that wall. There was nowhere to retreat, and Irdan stepped in one last time to finish him off. He grabbed him by the shoulder and pressed him against the rock, and in that moment, it was over. There was nothing more to it. Kaizen didn't resist. He lay beneath another man's hand, looking up, and said only one thing. He said that the fighter had already lost his footing, and that this was the third point. Irden K froze. His hand was on the shoulder of his prone opponent. That was exactly why he had crossed out Kaizen's first mark and deducted 2 days from his time in front of 3 witnesses. He held that hold for a quarter of a breath. Then he let go. He straightened up, turned to the referee, and announced it himself. He said he had violated the third point of the selection rules. He said that the round had been forfeited by the selection curator. He said it clearly and loudly and didn't wait for anyone else to speak. Marin Tuk struck the stone with his whip. It grew so quiet in the arena that you could hear someone drop a bucket on the lower tier. Kaizen got up on all fours against the wall and then to his feet. His left arm wouldn't bend, and a steady ringing filled his right ear. He had received his third mark. He had received it at noon on the 7th day. He had been accepted into the Tyran Academy. His contract with House Lan for that year was now null and void. The crowd did not cheer him on. The crowd dispersed in silence, and that was worse than a boo. Irden K took his jacket from the clerk and approached him. He was a head taller, and heat radiated from him like a stone. He asked how long it had been since Kaizen had known about the third clause. Kaizen said he'd heard it from the curator on the first evening. Irden paused and asked a second question. He asked if the boy knew about Talik. Kaizen replied that he did. Irden asked why he hadn't named him. Kaizen said that naming him would have cost him a circle, but it would have cost him even more later. Irdan-K looked at him for a long time. Then he said that in 4 years he hadn't met a single person at the academy who could think beyond a single evening. He said that he alone maintained order at the academy, and that this order was full of holes, and that he knew it. He said he'd submitted that directive for review 11 times, and that all 11 documents had gone to the assignment department, and not a single one had come back. He didn't ask for anything. He walked away, straight as always. The first person to approach Kaizen after that wasn't a friend. It was Tolvin Guess who approached him. He stood in a tin uniform with a tight bandage on his knee, and his face had the look of someone who was rethinking everything he had ever known. He said he had been in the circle against Kaizen twice, and neither time had understood what had happened. He said he'd thought it was because of his knee. He said he'd now seen the same thing done to a man with a perfectly healthy knee. He said his father led descents in Dene, and that he'd grown up among those who consider strength the only value. He said this was the first time he'd seen a different value. Then he did something Kaizen hadn't expected at all. He asked to be the third in the circle. He said that the paired form allows for changes in composition, and that he was ready to stand with the Coleman and the thief if they explained to him where to look. Kaizen looked at him with a cold stare. The step was steel. The vein was a straight line. The ceiling was a storm. It was the second storm ceiling in a week, and both had been found among those the Academy had already written off. Kaizen said he'd think about it until evening. He didn't say this to drive up the price. He said it because Tolvin Guess was from List, and having someone from List among them meant attention they weren't yet ready to handle. The evening settled everything without him. At lights out, a clerk came to the barracks and read the order aloud. The order was brief and contained not a single superfluous word. Based on the final tally, transfer student Kaizen Ro is removed from the recruitment supervisor's jurisdiction. Reason: victory in the ring over the supervisor. The student was transferred to the direct jurisdiction of the placement department of the Tyran Academy. Report tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Signed, Soren Teed. Kaizen listened and understood what had actually happened. He had won 3 marks and remained at the academy. And at the same time, he had lost everything he had possessed up to that point. As long as he was a lowly nobody under Irden K, No one bothered him or even looked at him. Now he had no curator at all. He stood directly beneath a man above whose head shone a crown-level rank and a second red line that Merlo could not read. He stepped out into the courtyard and looked up at the upper wing. In Soren Teed's window, a lamp was burning on the highest distillation wick. The light was even and white and didn't flicker. Kaizen stood there for a moment, then returned to the barracks, took out Garnlow's book, and opened it to the last third. He was looking for the 11 papers that Earden K had submitted. The papers weren't in the book because the book wasn't about the papers, but there was something else. Opposite each of Garnlow's handwritten entries was the date the order was issued, and these dates always preceded the announcement by 1 day, by 2 days, by a week. Kaizen flipped back through the pages to check, and the pattern held true for 12 years in a row. The orders for the descents were drawn up before anyone even knew a descent was coming. That meant the selection of people wasn't based on need. It was done according to a list compiled in advance. And then Kaizen did something he hadn't done even once since day one. He opened the book to the very end. The last pages contained blank line sheets for future assignments. Garnlow hadn't had time to fill them out. But the first blank page wasn't empty. Written on it in someone else's handwriting was the roster. 8 names for the second horizon descent. There was no date. At the top of the list was the name Kaizen Ro. The name was written on a blank page in neat clerical handwriting, and the ink was still fresh. Kaizen stared at it and calculated the timeline. Garnlow had died on the second day. That meant the entry had been made while the warden was still alive, and before Kaizen had taken a single mark. Before he had won a round against Tolvin Guess. Perhaps even before he had entered the gate at all. He checked the remaining 7 names. Vigo Tana wasn't there. Oshina Kara wasn't there. So the roster wasn't written for his team. That meant he'd assembled the team himself, by chance, and that was the only thing they didn't know. He closed the book, wrapped it back in the canvas, and that night hid it not under the floorboard, but in the ashes beneath the 3rd stove in the service wing. In the morning, he reported for duty at the first hour. The assignment department occupied 2 rooms in the upper wing. In the first room, 4 clerks sat transcribing orders. In the second sat Soren Teed. Kaizen was led through the first room, and he managed to glance at all 4 of them. Bone, tin, dust. None of them reached higher than bone. The department that decided who would go down was staffed by people without any limits. It was set up that way on purpose, and Kaizen understood why even before he sat down. People like that don't argue. Soren Teed greeted him just as he had on the first evening. He said he was glad to see him. He said he held no grudge over the refusal, and that the refusal had been reasonable. He said that now everything was falling into place better than before. He placed a stack of forms and a pen in front of Kaizen and explained the job. The job was simple. Transcribe the compositions neatly from the rough drafts. Add the date. Check the names against the class rosters. Kaizen looked at the first sheet and realized what he'd just been handed. He'd been given the whole picture. Soren Teed knew this. He'd done it openly, and so it wasn't a mistake, but a test. Kaizen picked up the quill and began to write. The next 4 days passed in a blur of work. On the first day, he transcribed 61 assignments and noticed that the black sheets weren't coming from the academy. A man in a gray uniform from the city side brought them in and carried the empty box back out. On the second day, he learned the code, a letter and a number. The letter stood for the horizon. The number didn't mean a number or a date. The number meant a share. Kaizen checked 36 assignments, and the pattern became clear. Next to the names of those who didn't return was a number higher than 5. Next to the names of those who returned was a number lower than 2. Someone had calculated in advance how many people would go down and not come back up. And they weren't counting by people, they were counting by boxes. On the third day, he spotted a pattern. The higher the percentage in a shift, the more veins were brought up from that descent. The shaft yielded veins more generously when people remained in the bowl. The Academy didn't lose its porters, the Academy paid with them. On the fourth day, Kaizen found a column that none of the clerks had filled out. It was located at the edge, narrow, and in the old records, a single word would sometimes appear there: receiver. He picked up 30 sheets in a row, and in 28 of them, the column was empty. In 2, the same word appeared: bucket. All this time, he never stopped doing his second job. He gathered people, selecting them according to a single rule. He took only those whose ceiling was higher than the threshold and whom the Academy had already written off. The first was Saren Well. She scrubbed floors in the infirmary and had no student sponsorship because she came from a family of third-class debtors. Kaizen had seen her entry that very night when Garnlo died. A stranger's pain lived on. Her ceiling was bone. He went up to her and said he'd seen her holding the boy with the burn by the shoulders that evening while the doctor cut into him, and that the boy hadn't screamed. He said the doctor in that infirmary had a ceiling lower than hers. He didn't explain how he knew. Saren Well looked at him and said she wasn't allowed to study. Kaizen said that studying and treating patients were two different things, and that down below, no one asks for a diploma. The second was Len Oyo, that very same boy with the burn. He was 14 and counted his steps aloud, and for that he was chased out of every stream. The step counting lived on. The ceiling was steel. Kaizen sat him on the ledge above the recess and asked him to count how many steps it took Marin took to go from one end to the other. Len named the number without looking down and named 3 more numbers that Kaizen hadn't asked for. He said how many steps it was to the stairs, how many to the north gallery, and how many to the well. He kept the entire rock measured in steps in his head. 4 days later, there were 5 of them. Vigo Tan, who stood. Ocean Kerr, who walked where he wasn't. Saren Well, who kept people alive. Len Oyo, who measured the distance. And Kaizen, who saw. They would gather after lights out by the third furnace, and Kaizen didn't tell them about the measure or the book. He told them something else. He told them which of them would break down where and what to do about it. He told Vigo that he wouldn't last a long walk, and that his place was always the bottleneck. He told Ocean that his own speed would be his undoing, and that speed was needed only for the last 4 steps. He told Saren that she was spreading herself too thin for everyone, and that on the descent, she would have to choose. She said she wouldn't choose. He didn't argue and noted this down as their first crack. The skeptic arrived on the 5th day and came from above. The department's senior clerk was named Haven Lask. He had sat at the first desk for 11 years with a tin step and a tin ceiling above him. From day 1, he hadn't spoken a word to Kaizen other than official business. On the 5th day, he took his transcribed sheets for verification and pored over them for 2 hours. Then he stood up, walked over, and placed the stack on the desk. He said that in 11 years, he had never seen anyone list the date of preparation separately from the date of announcement. He said that the boy had separated these 2 dates across 600 sheets, and that now the discrepancy was evident in the ledger. He said that he himself had always seen this discrepancy and had always believed that was how it should be. His expression wasn't angry. It was the kind of expression a person has who, for 11 years, had read one line and in the 12th year, read a different word in it. He asked if the boy understood what he had done. Kaizen said he did. Haven Lask stood there a little longer and said that the rough drafts were brought by a man from the city office at the House of Lan. Then he returned to his desk and did not look up again that day. Kaizen sat with a pen in his hand, but did not write. The House of Lan held his debt. The House of Lan sent the rough drafts of the outfits upstairs. So the debt office and the allocation department were one and the same body with 2 names. So he hadn't been bought into the academy. He'd been transferred here. That evening, Niera's soul found him in the courtyard. She had been ranked first on the list for 4 years, and until that day had said nothing to him except for a single phrase about the third circle. She said she'd watched the circle with the curator. She said she'd seen him stand up 17 times. Then she said the most important thing. She said the list wasn't a list of the strong. She said the list was a list of those the academy was willing to show off to the city. She said they'd kept her at the top for 4 years, not because she was the best. They kept her because she was the only one they could put on display without fear. She said that in 4 years, she had never once been sent below the first horizon. Kaizen asked why she was telling him this. Niera Soul said she had a brother, and that her brother had gone to the second horizon in the class before last. She said she had submitted petitions 9 times. She said that all 9 had been sent to the assignment department. Kaizen looked at her intently. He hadn't intended to. He did it before he even thought about it. Blood spurted from both eyes, and inside his head, the word storm gnawed its way another finger's width deeper, and he felt it physically as a chill beneath his skull. 4 lines hovered above Niera Soul. Step, steal. Vein, direct strike. Crack, brother. Ceiling, crown. The second crown was at the Tyrant Academy. The first sat upstairs in the paper room, signing orders. The second stood before him in the courtyard and knew nothing of herself. Kaizen stood there, holding it all in his mind, and realized that he now held in his hands something that could not be spoken aloud under any circumstances. A person who has learned their limit ceases to grow toward it and begins to fall toward it. He had seen this in the neighbor's blacksmith when he was 7 and remembered it for the rest of his life. He had just told her that petitions would never be accepted and that she shouldn't submit petitions. She asked what she should submit instead. He said she should present herself in the very outfit they wouldn't accept. Niera Soul looked at him and walked away, and she was the first person from the list to leave him without looking back or laughing. That night, Kaizen returned to the cathedral. He didn't have a key. Ocean Kerr unlocked the door for him in the blink of an eye and stayed outside on the ledge, counting the guard's footsteps along with Leno Oyo. Kaizen lit a single lamp and took out the prepared uniforms for the coming week from the closet. He was looking for one in particular. He was looking for the assignment for the second horizon. The assignment lay third from the top and was already signed, sealed, and dated. Departure in 2 days. The roster contained 8 names: Kaizen Ro, Vigo Tan, Ocean Kerr, Saren Well, Len Oyo, Tolvin Guess, Irden K, Niera Soul. 8 people, including 2 from the list, as well as number 2 and number 1. People who, over the past week, had approached him one by one on their own. In the share column, the number 8 was listed. He had never seen a number higher than 6. In the receiver column, the word bucket was written. Kaizen lowered the lamp and looked at the signature at the bottom of the sheet. The signature wasn't Sorana Teed's. It was unfamiliar, and he didn't recognize the handwriting. He held the sheet closer to the light, and a line unfolded before his eyes right above the signature. Not over a person, over the paper. It was short and not gray. It was red and contained the same dense symbols he'd seen over Soran Ted on that first evening. And this time, the meter read it all the way through. Ocean Kerr stepped back from the iron and said there were people standing above and that they weren't turning the gate. He said he could hear their footsteps and their breathing and that there were at least 20 of them up there. Irden K struck the gate with the hilt a 3rd time and a 4th time, but the sound was absorbed by the iron and didn't come back. Kaizen stopped him. He said they couldn't keep banging anymore. He said that every blow told the people upstairs how much strength they had left. He sat down on a rock and began counting aloud what they had. 6 lamps on low heat. They'd burn for 7 hours. Water, 2 sips each. 1 body. 1 man with a slashed thigh. 1 man who'd been hauling crates for 8 hours without eating. Sarenwell said that Len Oyo needed a clean spot and a needle, and that in 6 hours the wound would start to rot, and by then she wouldn't be able to do anything about it. She said this matter-of-factly, without asking for anything. Kaizen looked at the boy. Len Oyo lay against the wall, moving his lips. He was counting the turns even now. Kaizen stood up and said, "Down." Niera Sol asked him to repeat himself. He said that the side passage was on the 142nd turn, that he was going up, and that where the spiral ended, the passage was just beginning. Irden K said that heading down from the cover went against everything porters were taught. Kaizen said that porters were taught by those who write the orders. Irden paused and was the first to head down. The descent took 2 hours and was completed in 3 stages. The first stage was easy, and they moved quickly, with Vigo Tan carrying Tolvin Guess's body on his shoulder. On the 200th turn, he set the body down on a rock for the first time, sat down beside it, and stayed there for as long as he was allowed. The second stage was worse. The first lamp went out, and Ocean Kerr said the bulb inside was old. He said he'd taken the lamps from the storage room, not the lamp room, and that the storage room held items that had already been written off. He said it was his fault. Kaizen said there was no time for blame and that they now had 5 lamps. The third run took place in semi-darkness along the outer wall, and they held onto the rope. It was the same rope from 200 paces back, and Ocean tied it to the staples he'd found with Dustmorn's hook. The staples were spaced 20 turns apart and had been hammered in low and crooked. They were truly not meant for humans. At the 142nd turn, Len Oyo raised his head and said, "It's here." He said the echo was coming from the side, that the wall was 4 steps away, and that the passage was further to the left than it seemed. He couldn't see anything. He could hear it. Ocean Kerr took those 4 steps, ran his hand along the rock, and found a crevice. The crevice was chest-high and shoulder-wide, and it wasn't visible from 3 steps away because the rock sloped away in a fold. For 12 years, thousands of porters had walked past it without turning their heads. Kaizen went first. The passage hadn't been carved out. It had been washed out by water long ago, and its walls were smooth and undulating. It sloped upward at such an angle that one could only walk by leaning backward. Vigo Tan couldn't get through. He got stuck on the 5th step with his shoulders and stood there in silence. He took off his outer jacket, then his shirt, then removed his belt, but still couldn't get through. He said he couldn't drag Tolvin's body through there. He said it calmly, and it was worse than a scream. Irden K said that the dead are left on the spiral platform, that the second team comes for them, and that this is written in the porter's charter. He said there would be no second team. Then he himself pulled his cloak from under the body, wrapped it around the face, and folded the arms. He recorded the location on paper, noted the turn, and wrote down the name. He took his time doing this, and no one interrupted him. Vigo Tan was only moved into the passageway once Ocean Kerr had tied a cord under his armpits, and the 3 of them pulled from above while Sarenwell pushed from below. He scraped his back raw from his shoulder blades to his waist and didn't say a word. The passageway ascended 100 steps. Len Oyo counted them while lying on his back as they dragged him along. At the 100th step, the passage ran into masonry. The masonry was made of smooth, hewn stones set in mortar, and the mortar was gray and hard. Kaizen ran his hand over it and realized that Dustmorn hadn't lied. The stone was foreign. The rock around it was reddish and layered. The masonry was gray and smooth, and it had been brought here from above. Vigo Tan braced his back against the wall and his feet against the masonry and began to push. He pushed for a quarter of an hour, but the masonry didn't budge. Then Ocean Kerr found a seam. He said that the mason who had built this wall had been in a hurry and had set the bottom row with a thin layer of mortar. He pried out the mortar with the tip of his cleaver and removed one stone, followed by a second. Vigotan thrust his shoulder into the breach and carried out 3 rows at once. Behind the masonry was a shaft. The shaft led upward. It was narrow, lined with rusty brackets, and a chill seeped in from above. They climbed up the brackets for 9 minutes. Lena Oyo was hauled up on a rope. The shaft ended with a wooden shield that had been nailed shut from the inside, and Vigo knocked it out with a single blow. They emerged into a storage room. The storeroom was low-ceilinged and long, filled with barrels of lime, sacks of sand, and stacks of hewn stone. It was a storage area for masonry work and stood against the north wall of the farmyard. A man was sitting in the storeroom, sharpening a trowel on a block of wood. He was nearing 60, and his hands were white with lime up to his elbows. His name was Hoyd Saran, and he had been laying walls at the Tyrene Academy for 30 years. He looked up and saw 8 men crawling out from under the floor, covered in blood, one naked to the waist and one tied to a rope. He didn't scream. He stood up, walked over to the breach, peered down, and saw his masonry broken through from the other side. He dropped to his knees, ran his fingers through the mortar, and sniffed the break. Then he sat down right on the floor. He said he'd built that wall 6 years ago, according to an order from the maintenance department. He said the work order stated that the shaft was old, that bad air was coming from it, and that it needed to be sealed for people's safety. He said he took 2 apprentices and sealed it in a single day, applying the mortar in a thin joint because he was in a hurry to finish by evening. He said he'd been building walls at this academy for 30 years and had never once asked why. Kaizen told him that behind this wall began a passage leading to the 142nd level. He said that 6 years ago, anyone who had remained below could have climbed up through that passage. Hoyd Saran sat on the floor, staring at his white hands. He asked how many of them there had been. Irdan K. said that 60 had gone down that passage and 17 had returned. The stonemason counted in his head for a long time. Then he said that those apprentices had long since left the academy and that he hadn't seen a single one of them since. He stood up and walked silently to the door, locking it from the inside with a wooden bar. He said they wouldn't be looking for them here until morning because the masonry warehouse was only opened once a week. He brought them water, bread, and an old blanket, and made a bed on the stone for Len Oyo. Saren Well washed her hands in lime water and sat down to sew. Ozum Terry had once given her his list of what they were taking down, and on that list was a needle and some twisted silk, and she had carried all of it in a small bag under her shirt for 8 hours. She sewed the boy's thigh by the light of 3 lamps, and Hoyd Saren held his legs. Len Oyo didn't scream. He counted the stitches aloud. He counted 29. Kaizen sat by the wall, listening to the counting, and realized he had to make a decision right then. He told Ocean Kerr to go on a reconnaissance mission. Ocean left through the window near the ceiling and returned half an hour later. The look on his face was such that Kaizen stood up before Ocean even spoke. Ocean said that a guard was standing by the hatch and that people in gray jackets were lined up in 2 rows around him and that they weren't students. He said he'd counted 26 jackets. He said that the admissions office was sealed off, that there was a guard at the door, and that Sarana Teda wasn't there. He said that a new notice was posted on the list in the courtyard and that there was a crowd gathered around it. And he said one last thing. He said that the academy gates were wide open and that carts had been passing through them all night from the city side. Kaizen went out on his own. He walked along the wall of the service courtyard, staying in the shadows, and reached the list. The notice hung beneath the board with the 100 names. It contained 3 lines. The first line announced that the assignment department of the Terran Academy was being placed under the direct administration of the Lan House office in the city of Den on the basis of an outstanding obligation. The second line announced that Soran Tade, Master of Distribution, had been suspended from all duties pending settlement. The third line announced that shift number 9 on the second horizon had been closed with a shortfall, and that the shortfall had been covered at 4 o'clock in the morning. Kaizen read the third line and did not understand it at first. He read it a second time. Then he walked toward the gate. He walked in the open, and no one stopped him because the city folk were standing in the gray, and they didn't recognize anyone by sight. Dustmorn was sitting on a stone right by the gate. His face was battered, and his right arm was hanging limply. He saw Kaizen and tried to stand up, but couldn't. He said he had been holding the gate. He said that he and she had guarded the gate together until 3 o'clock, and that then 26 men with clubs had arrived. He said that they had opened the hatch at 4 o'clock, lowered one man down, and closed it again. He said that she hadn't screamed or struggled. He said that she had walked toward the throat herself when she saw that he was being beaten. Kaizen stood by the gate, clutching the cold iron, his hands numb. He asked who had given the order. Dustmorn raised his good hand and pointed to the upper wing. In the window of the distribution department, a lamp burned on the top distillation column. The light was even and white and did not flicker. A man sat at Sarana Tada's desk, sorting through papers. Kaizen looked over there, but from that distance, the measure didn't display a single line of text. It showed only his height and the angle of his head. Dustmorn said that the clerk's name was Velt Han and that he had arrived yesterday at noon in a wagon along with her. Kaizen stood by the gate just long enough to stop feeling the iron beneath his palms. Then he let go of the gate and did the first thing that needed to be done. He didn't go to the upper wing. He lifted Dustmorn off the stone and led him across the courtyard to the infirmary, walking slowly because the old man couldn't walk fast. In the infirmary, Ozum Terry set his arm and looked at Kaizen over the lamp, remarking that the boy was as white as chalk. Kaizen asked him about the third flood. The healer explained that the third flood was the old count of the year by the river beneath the cliff, and that there were 6 days left until it arrived. Kaizen did the math and went out. An hour later, he gathered everyone in the stoneworks warehouse. There were 9 of them, including Hoyd Saran and Dustmorn. He laid out what he knew on the floor with charcoal and spoke briefly. He said they couldn't go down now. He said 26 men were guarding the hatch, 8 were at the gate, and it was impossible to open it secretly. He said his mother was alive because her share was recorded as settled. He said a settled share doesn't return upstairs on its own. Niera Sol asked how much time they had. Kaizen said 6 days. He said that in the red line above Sorrentide, the deadline was set until the third flood, and that this deadline was also listed in the order. Irden K asked where he read such things. Kaizen looked at him and told the truth for the first time in all this time. He said he sees 4 lines above people: a step, a crack, a vein, ceiling. He said that a 5th line stood above obligations and that it was red. He said that for every deep gaze, he paid with his own limit, and that his limit had been a storm, and that less than half of that storm remained. He said this calmly and didn't wait for a response. It was quiet in the warehouse. Hoyd Saran stared at his hands. Dustmorn nodded once, like a man who'd known for 12 years that such things happen. Oshin Kerr said he'd always thought the boy was looking at his feet. Irden K said only that he now understood the third point. Niera Sol said nothing and didn't ask about herself, and Kaizen was more grateful to her for that than for anything else. The next 2 days passed, and they went through 4 cuts. The first cut went through paper. Haven Lusk came to the warehouse on his own on the second night and brought not paper, but a memory. The department had been sealed off, and he wasn't allowed behind his own desk, so for 11 years he'd kept in his head what he'd been transcribing. He said that over the past 6 years, 419 people had passed through the second horizon. Kaizen recalled the red line above the reception desk, and the number matched down to the last digit. Haven Lusk said that every year the Academy wrote these people off as having perished in a cave-in or during a descent, and that their families were paid third-class compensation. He said the payments were issued by the Lan House office. He said the money went one way and the people the other, and that the cycle closed out there. The second route ran through the city. Oshin-Kur had climbed down the cliff face along the outer wall that night, circled around the Lan House office, and returned by morning. He said there was a debtor's board hanging in the office with over 200 names on it, and that next to a third of them was a note indicating a transfer to the Tyrene Academy under the academic pay grade. He said 2 clerks were counting the shortfall aloud and mentioning the third spill. He said that no one in town knew anything about it, and that the townspeople considered the academy the pride of Dayan. The third cut went through the rock. Over the course of a day, Hoyd Saran went through all his old assignments from the past 30 years and recalled 3 places where he had been ordered to seal off passages without explanation. He marked them on his own map of the cliff with charcoal. One spot was that very mine. The second was on the lower level. The third was right beneath the capstone, and there he had placed not a wall, but a box. He said that this box ran along the gate, and that if 2 rows of stone were removed from it, a cavity would open up large enough for a person to fit inside, through which the entire throat of the spiral could be seen. He said he'd built it blindly and didn't know why. The fourth cut ran through the bylaws. Irden K sat for 2 days poring over the Academy's rules and didn't sleep. He wasn't looking for a loophole. He was looking for a clause that stood on its own. He found it toward evening on the second day. The article was old and had not been repealed because it had been forgotten. The first on the list had the right, once a year, to demand an exhibition descent near the city. The exhibition descent was held during the day. The city council, the guild elders, and the students' families were invited to attend. The hatch was thrown wide open and kept that way until the team returned. Only the full Council of Masters could deny the first on the list. The Tyrene Academy hadn't convened the full Council of Masters in 4 years because the Department of Allocation had been making all the decisions on its own. Irden placed the document in front of Niera Sol. She read the article for a long time. Then she said that for 4 years she had been a showcase, and that now the showcase would have to be shattered from within. She said she would submit the request in the morning and sign it with her own name. Irden K said he would sign second as the recruitment supervisor, and that his removal had not been announced. The skeptic arrived on the 3rd day, coming from a place where no one was expecting him. Marin Took stood on the sidelines throughout the preparations and never approached them even once. He had been setting up the circles and maintaining the site for 20 years, and he was the first to tell Kaizen that they wouldn't let him live to see the 3rd mark. On the 3rd day, he came to the Stoneworks warehouse, stood in the doorway, and remained silent for a long time. Then he said he remembered Garn Lo when he was young. He said that Garn Lo, too, had once found a piece of paper and gathered people around him, and that he hadn't been killed. He'd simply been transferred to barracks guard duty and kept alive for 12 years so that everyone could see how it all ended. He said he'd watched this go on for 20 years and decided it was more honest to keep the site to himself and stay out of it. He said that yesterday he'd watched the city officials in gray jackets standing at the gate of his excavation site, and that he'd realized one thing. He said that the site he'd held for 20 years wasn't his. Then he laid a bunch of keys to the pit and the lower storage rooms on the floor and said that the ceremonial descent goes through the circle, that the site manager prepares the circle, and that he himself would prepare it. The demand was submitted on the morning of the fourth day. Niera Sol walked openly into the distribution office past the guard, and the guard let her through because everyone knew the first person on the list by sight. Velthan took the list, read it, and his expression did not change. The manager of the land house was in his late 30s. He was lean, clean-shaven, and spoke softly. Kaizen stood 3 paces behind Niera's shoulder and stared intently at him. Blood rushed from both his eyes at once, and his head grew cold. The word storm within his line had eroded another finger's width, and now only a third of it remained. 4 lines stood above Velthan, and all 4 were ordinary and gray. Step, tin. Life, account. Crack, back. Ceiling, tin. And above them stood the 5th, red. Holder, ladle. Debt, 41 shares, due by the 3rd flood. Kaizen read it and added up the last figure that didn't match. The steward of the land house was not the master of the account. He was just as much in debt as Soren Teed. House Land bought the debts of the townspeople, transferred people to the academy, and sent them down, and all the while he himself was hanging by a thread from the one who sits by the opening. Velthan set aside the demand and said that the demonstration descent was an old and respected tradition. He said he wouldn't stand in her way. He said that, on the contrary, he would convene the city council himself and invite the guild elders, and that the academy should demonstrate its work to the city. He said this calmly and kindly, and that kindness made Kaizen's neck stiffen, just as it had for Soren Teed on that first evening. Niera Sol stepped out of the lecture hall and, in the courtyard, asked why he had agreed so readily. Kaizen said that they had just opened the lid for a man who needed to go up more than they needed to go down. Soren Teed was locked away in his own rooms in the upper wing, and the guard at his door was from the city. Kaizen climbed in through his window that night, and Ocean Kerr held the rope. The Magister was awake. He sat at an empty desk without a single sheet of paper, and that was more terrifying to him than the lock. Kaizen told him he'd seen the red line above Velthan and named a number. Soren Teed closed his eyes. He said that for 22 years he had paid with other people's lives so as not to pay with his own. He said that every year he had put off settling the account until the next, and that each time the share had grown. He said that at first the share was 1. Kaizen asked how the account could be settled. Soren Teed said that the account could be settled in 2 ways, with a share or with himself. He said that for all 22 years he had chosen the former. He said that now even that had been taken from him. He said that a deposed magister could not sign for a single share, and that according to the account, he was now an empty debtor, and that the bucket took empty debtors without a ceremony. The ceremonial descent was scheduled for the 6th day. It was the day of the 3rd flood, and Velthan personally set the date, explaining to the city that the tradition would be observed according to the old calendar. The courtyard was full from dawn. The city council arrived. The guild elders arrived. The families of the apprentices from Dan arrived and stood along the walls, looking at the board with the 100 names. Marin Took led the squad to the gate and announced the roster according to the regulations. Irden K as senior. Niera Sol by virtue of being first on the list. Kaizen Ro. Vigo Tan. Ocean Kerr. Saren Well. Len Oyo at the top count by the lid. 8 men in gray jackets stepped away from the gate because there was no reason for them to stand there while the city was present. The apprentices took over the gate. They threw the hatch wide open and secured it with struts. According to the regulations for a demonstration descent, it could not be lowered until the squad returned. Kaizen stood at the very edge of the throat, looking down into the darkness, holding Dustmorna's hook in his hand. He waited for Marintuk's signal. There was no signal. Instead, a sound came from below. It was steady and low, like the sound of a crate being dragged across stone. Len Oyo, on the upper belay station, raised his head and spoke first. He said the sound was coming upward. He said it wasn't just one crate. He said there were many of them, and that they were moving in a spiral at a steady pace. A warm draft swept up from the gorge, and within that warmth was light. The light was even and white, like that from a lamp on the highest distillation level, and it rose from below, flooding the walls of the spiral. The crowd in the courtyard fell silent. The first man, dressed in rags, emerged from the throat onto the stone. Behind him came a second, then a third. They emerged row after row, carrying the boxes and setting them down in the courtyard in front of the city council, then turning around and walking back toward the throat. There were 40 of them. They looked at no one. The last to emerge from the tunnel was the receiver. He stepped out into the sunlight for the first time in many years, paused, and surveyed the courtyard, the board with the 100 names, and the city elders. His face was smooth and well-fed. He said he had come to collect his payment. The clerk stood on a stone in the courtyard, and the sun shone down on him without affecting him in the least. He didn't squint. He surveyed the city council, the guild elders, and the families of the apprentices, and spoke in the manner used in the office during an inventory. He said that the Tyrant Academy had been keeping records for 6 years. He said the accounts had been kept honestly, and that both sides were aware of the terms. He said there were 4 hours left until the third flood, and that during that time, 41 shares belonging to the Land House office and 9 shares belonging to the distribution department must be settled. He announced the figures aloud before the entire city, and that was the extent of his calculation. He had not come to intimidate anyone. He had come to present the figures. The courtyard was silent. Then one of the workshop foremen asked what a share was. The receiver replied calmly, saying that a share was a person. At that, the courtyard buzzed with murmurs. Veltan stepped forward and did the only thing a foreman could do. He announced that the Land House office was transferring the Academy's accounts to the institution, and that all obligations were being transferred to the Department of Allocation under the transfer agreement. He spoke quickly and articulately, and he allocated 41 shares among the people standing in the courtyard. Kaizen looked at him and saw how the red line above the steward flickered and grew shorter. It became 40, and then 39. It grew shorter as he spoke. So the account was being rewritten right there, rewritten by the words spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Kaizen finally grasped the mechanism and understood it before Veltan had even finished speaking. The red line wasn't anchored to the paper. It was anchored to acknowledgement. As long as no one contested the tally aloud, the tally was correct. He stepped forward and spoke loudly, addressing not the receptionist. He addressed the city council. He said that the teams for the descents at the Tyrant Academy were assembled before they were announced. He mentioned 12 years. He said that each order included a column for the share, and that the share indicated how many people would not make it to the top, and that the figure was entered before the people began their descent. He said that he had transcribed 600 sheets by hand, and that the dates of preparation and the dates of announcement differed in them. Haven Lusk stepped out of the crowd and stood beside him, confirming every word and identifying himself as the department's senior scribe for the past 11 years. He said he had witnessed this discrepancy for all 11 years and had believed that was how it was supposed to be. He said he now thought otherwise. Kaizen looked at the red line above Veltan. It had stopped decreasing. It stood at 39 and was trembling. The registrar turned his head for the first time. He looked at Kaizen and looked at him for a long time, and for the first time, Kaizen saw something resembling the workings of thought on that smooth face. Then Hoyd Saran stepped forward. The Mason held in his hands his old work order from the maintenance department, dated 6 years ago. He told the city that 6 years ago, based on that work order, he had laid the foundation for a shaft that led up from the 142nd level. He said the work order mentioned bad air. He said that yesterday he had climbed out of that shaft with 8 living people and that he had seen his wall broken through from the other side. He said that he had spent 30 years building walls at the academy and that he would take personal responsibility for this one. He placed the work order on a stone in front of the council. The red line above Velthan dropped to 31. Things moved quickly from there. Dustmorn came out with his arm in a sling and said that 6 years ago he had gone down with 60 men and returned with 17, and that he knew about the side passage but had kept quiet because no one had asked him. He said that now they had asked. Ozum Terry named the number of porters who had been written off in the infirmary as having died during descents, and said that he had never seen the bodies and that he had signed the paperwork. Marin Took said that he had been setting circles for 20 years and knew that the list was not compiled based on strength. Niera Sol told the city that she had been ranked first on the list for 4 years and had never fallen below the first horizon, and that she had submitted 9 petitions regarding her brother, all of which had gone to the cathedral and never returned. She said that her brother was alive and standing down by the opening, and that his name was Tavish Sol. Each name was struck off the list. Kaizen watched the red line above the clerk, and it was falling. 28, 22, 19. The crowd in the courtyard ceased to be a crowd and became witnesses, and that was the whole difference. Velthan realized this before the clerk did. He fell silent mid-sentence and began to retreat toward the gallery, moving steadily and unhurriedly. 6 steps from the door, he turned and walked quickly away. Ocean Kerr took him down on the 4th step. He didn't strike him. He swept his ankle, grabbed him by the collar, and sat him down on a stone in front of the council. The receptionist raised his hand, and the 40 men by the crates set down their crates and turned around. Vigo Tan stood at the throat of the spiral and blocked it with his body. He stood bare to the waist, his back scraped raw from his shoulder blades to his waist, and he did not move a single time. Irden K stood to his right, in the spot Tolvin Guess had occupied 6 days earlier. Niera Sol joined the 40 men with a work spear, striking with the flat of the blade as she searched for her brother. Marin Took led the students from the training ground, and they secured the courtyard. Kaizen worked with his glances. He looked deeply and called out where each person had an old bone injury or a dislocated shoulder, and Vago and Ocean acted on his words. He used up 3 glances, and on the 4th, blood rose in his throat. He sat down on a rock, and the word storm within his line was eroded down to the last quarter. Sarenwell held him by the shoulders and said he would go blind. He said he would go blind later. Niera Sol found Tevis Sol at the edge of the courtyard. He was coming toward her with a cleaver and didn't recognize her, and she couldn't strike him, not even with the flat of her hand. She dropped her spear and took his hands in hers, holding him until he grew tired. He grew tired after a minute because his limit had been cut off and his strength was reduced to dust. She sat down with him on the rock, and he sat beside her, staring at the ground. His crack was the only line still standing above him. In it stood the word, sister. The workers were laid out on the rock without a single casualty because Kaizen had called out their weaknesses before they could strike. The receiver stood at the throat and watched as it all came to an end. The red line above Velthan fell to 11 and stopped. The city council counted aloud and demanded documents, while the guild elders shouted about their guild lists of debtors. The recorder raised his hand for the third time and said that the tally could be contested only by the one who kept it. He said that the scribes, masons, and healers had not kept the tally. He said that the distribution department had kept the accounts and that its magistrate had been suspended and was remaining silent. He said that less than an hour remained until the third distribution and that any uncovered debt would be transferred to the holder. He looked at Velt Han, and the steward turned pale. And then Soren Teed descended from the gallery. The guard at his door had dispersed that very morning because the city officials in gray jackets were now standing in the courtyard like defendants. The master of distribution stepped out onto the stone in his gray clothes, without a single piece of paper in his hands, and walked across the entire courtyard to the throat of the spiral. He stopped in front of the receptionist and turned toward the city. He said that 22 years ago he had descended to the second horizon and should not have ascended. He said that he had bought his way out and that he had paid the ransom with other people's lives for 22 years. He named the first number. He said that in the first year, the share was 1. He named the year and spoke the man's name aloud. Then he named the second year and the second name. He named them one by one, and the city listened, and no one interrupted. He reached the 419th name, and the last one he named was Selah Row. The red line above Soren Teed faded with each name. It was 9, then became 7, then became 3. With the last name, it went out completely, and along with it, his crown went out. Kaizen watched this and saw how the line of steps above the master changed before his eyes. Crown, storm, steel, bone, tin, ashes. Soren Teed stood at the mouth of the spiral like an ordinary elderly man without any limits, and this was the only time he looked calm. He told the receiver that the account was settled with a share or with himself, and that he no longer had any shares. The receiver nodded the way one nods when an inventory is correct. He said he accepted it. Soren Teed turned to Kaizen and said one thing. He said they would retrieve the woman. Then he stepped into the throat himself and walked down the spiral, and the receiver followed him, and 40 people rose from the stone and filed out in single file, carrying away the empty crates. The courtyard watched as they left. Tavis Sol stood up with everyone else, but Nierasol wouldn't let him go, holding him with both hands, and he didn't resist because his fracture proved stronger than the order. Of the 40, 6 remained at the top. The rest went down, and the light at the mouth of the spiral went out after a quarter of an hour. Selu Row was brought up 2 hours later. 2 of those who had left escorted her to the very edge of the chasm and returned. She sat down on a rock, and Kaizen approached and sat beside her. She said her cough had gone away. He looked at her, and the crack above her glowed brightly and evenly. He knew what that meant and said nothing. The city council met until dark. The landhouse office was sealed. Velta Hanna was taken into the city under guard. The Department of Distribution was closed until the new charter was issued. For the first time in 4 years, the Tyrant Academy convened a full council of masters. Irdan K was appointed interim head of the descents because he was the only one who had a document with dates marked on it and because he was the only one who had signed himself up for duty. Niera Sol was removed from the top spot on the list for filing a complaint against the department, and she said it was the best news she'd heard in 4 years. Marin Took reclaimed his training area and that very evening canceled all training sessions there for the week. Hoyd Saran went to the north wall and began dismantling his own masonry on the lower tier. Haven Lusk sat down to write a new duty roster and listed a single date as the first item. Len Oyo counted aloud how many people had gone down and how many had come up, and his tally came to 34. Kaizen sat at the edge of the yard, right by the throat, until late at night. According to the regulations for the demonstration descent, the hatch could not be closed until the team returned. The team returned. The hatch was closed at 3 o'clock, and the struts were secured. He watched as they did this and counted what was left. Tove and Guess lay on the landing of the 200th turn, and no one had sent a second team after him. Tavis Sol sat in the infirmary and didn't recognize his sister. 34 people had walked back down on their own 2 feet. Soren Tade had become a bucket or a share, and Kaizen didn't know which was worse. And 419 names were called out aloud before the city, and not a single one of them rose to the top. He sat there and, for the first time in 11 days, didn't count anything. Then he raised his head and looked at the water in the barrel by the gate. He had been looking into it for 8 years and had seen nothing above him. Above him there had always been an empty space. Now, a line stood above the reflection. It wasn't gray, it was red, and it consisted of 4 segments, each standing separately. Holder, bucket. Debt, 1 share. Accepted for transfer from Soren Tade, due by the 3rd flood. Kaizen looked into the barrel by the gate, and the red line above his reflection stood still and did not flicker. He dipped his palm into the water and shattered the reflection. The line disappeared along with it. He waited for the water to settle. The line returned to its original place. Bucket holder. Debt. 1 share. Accepted for carryover from Soren Tade, due by the 3rd flood. The 3rd flood occurred this morning. That meant the deadline was until the next one. Ozum Terry had said that the river beneath the cliff floods 3 times a year, and that the 3rd flood marks the end of the year. Kaizen did the math. He had a year minus 11 hours. He sat down on a rock by the barrel and began to check. A water carrier from the farmyard was passing by. Kaizen looked at her intently. He expected blood to well up in his eyes and a chill beneath his skull. None of that happened. His head remained clear. He looked into the water. The word storm within his own line stood at the same quarter and hadn't eroded a single finger's width. But the red line had changed. The term had shortened by 9 days. Kaizen sat and did the math. For 8 years, he paid for a glance with his limit. Now they'd stopped taking the limit. Now they were taking time. 9 days for a single deep glance. 40 glances, and a year would be gone. He checked again on the sweeper by the eastern wall, and the line had dropped by 9 days. 322. He didn't check anymore. He went to the stonework warehouse and told everything to the 3 of them, Irden K, Niera Sol, Saren Well. He explained the mechanics as he would have explained a patrol assignment. He said that the share had passed to him from Soren Tade, and that it had passed at the moment the master had called out all 419 names aloud. He said that the count doesn't disappear just because it's been closed. The count is carried over. Irden K asked who had chosen him. Kaizen said he didn't know. Niera Sol said she knew. She said she had been standing nearby and that, before stepping into the throat, Soren Tade had turned, not toward the city, nor toward the council. He had turned toward him alone. 11 days followed, and they passed through 4 cuts. The first cut went through paper. Haven Lask sat down at the empty desk of the sealed chancellery on the 2nd day and began writing a new order of service. As the first item, he established a single date. He noted that the service would be announced at the same hour it was drawn up, and that the senior scribe would be held personally responsible for any discrepancies. He noted that there would be no column for shares in the service. He removed this column from the form entirely and left an empty space in its place for the signature of everyone who went down. The Council of Masters approved the form on the fourth day. Haven Lusk transcribed 260 sheets in 11 days and aged more from this work than he had in over 11 years. The second cut went through the stone. Hoyd Saran dismantled his masonry in the lower tier in 3 days. Behind it was not a passageway, but a room 4 paces across. In the room stood empty crates, and a decayed jacket lay on the floor. The mason carried the crates out into the courtyard and placed them next to the board with the 100 names, without saying a word. Then he went to the third spot right under the cover and began dismantling the box along the gate. He worked alone and called no one. The third cut went through people. Marin Took opened the site on the 6th day and, first thing, removed all the selected circles for the week from it. He entered Vigo Tan into the combat stream by virtue of his authority as administrator and wrote bottleneck in the height column. He appointed Oshina Kara as the site scout and secured the reversal of his expulsion through the Council of Masters. The council unanimously overturned it because they were frightened and wanted to appear reformed. Len Oyo was assigned a post at the gate and the position of chief accountant, the first position at the Tyrant Academy that was paid for based on merit rather than strength. Saren Well was assigned a post at the infirmary. Ozum Terry wrote a letter of recommendation for her himself. He wrote that the third-class debtor sews better than he does and that he attests to this with his 19 years of experience. The fourth wave swept through the city, and that's when the main event began. Life came to an end. The academy didn't let the porters down for 11 days. Dan's lamp warehouses were emptied on the 7th day. On the 9th day, the street lamps in the lower streets went out. On the 10th day, the city's infirmaries stopped accepting patients because the highest grade distillate was being used for ointments and smoke, and without it, wounds were festering. On the 11th day, the workshop workers marched up to the academy gates. There were about 200 of them. Leading the way was the foreman of the lamplighters. His name was Raig Olt. He was broad-shouldered with a ruddy face and spoke loudly because he had worked by the distillation boilers for 30 years and had gone deaf in one ear. He stood before the board bearing 100 names and told the city council what all of Dan was thinking. He said that the academy had exposed its own corruption and that the workshops did not condemn it for that. He said that the corruption had been exposed and that was the end of it. He said that the lights were going out in the city. He said that his apprentices had been out of work for 11 days and that in a month the evaporative boilers would cool down and that it takes half a year to repair a cooled down boiler. He said that the children in the lower streets were walking in the dark. He asked the council what was more important. The council gave the academy 40 days. Kaizen stood by the wall, listening and realizing what had happened. They had settled their accounts with the city, and the city had applauded for 11 days. On the 12th day, the city sent its own bill. Irden K gathered them all that same evening. He said the dissents would have to be opened. He said that from now on, the dissents would follow a new form and omit the share column. Niera Sol said that the new form wouldn't change anything if the person keeping the old accounts was still down there. Kaizen said what mattered most. He said that 34 people had gone down of their own accord. He said that those 34 were now gathering the vein and that the vein was accumulating in the basin and wasn't flowing back up. He said that the receiver was holding it back on purpose. He said that the basin wasn't at war with the academy. The basin was simply waiting for the city to bring new people to it on its own. The skeptic arrived on the 13th day, coming from the list. Darren Val had been on the tin list for 6 years and once fought Kaizen in a one-on-one circle but couldn't outmaneuver him. He had a count vein and could see 2 moves ahead, which is why he was kept on the list. He came to the stoneworks warehouse in the evening, bringing with him a stack of old records he'd taken from the site's archives. He said he didn't believe a single word spoken in the courtyard. He said he decided to count them himself because counting was the only thing he knew how to do. He said he took 6 years' worth of work orders and tallied everyone who left and everyone who returned. He said he did the calculations 6 evenings in a row and got the same result every time. He placed his sheet of paper on the floor. The number on the sheet was 419. He said that until that day, he'd considered the academy a place where the strong prevail. He said that now he had recounted everything and realized that for 6 years, the academy had been treating people like boxes. He asked where he should stand. Kaizen looked at him from the top layer. The step was tin. The ceiling was bone. He told him to stand next to Lin Oyo on the top tier and keep the second book. He said that now they would have 2 ledgers, just as the academy had, and that the second one would be honest. The lid was opened on the 14th day. The descent led to the first horizon, guided by Erden K. There were 9 people in the party, and each row bore the signature of the porter himself. There were no columns for shares on the sheet. They returned 8 hours later with full crates and no losses. The city received its vein, and the workshops moved away from the gates. Kaizen stood by the hatch and counted not the crates, he counted the stillness. It was too even. On the 17th day, the hatch itself turned at the gates. Len Oyo was sitting on the upper platform and was the first to hear the sound. He shouted that a crate was coming from below. He said the crate was moving in a smooth spiral and that no one was carrying it. He said he could hear wood rubbing against stone and that there were no footsteps beneath it. The gate stood motionless. The chain hung loosely. The crate rose to the very top in half an hour and came to rest at the edge of the shaft. 8 men hoisted it onto the rock, and none of them could explain how it had moved. The crate was a standard porter's crate. It was empty. A single item lay at the bottom. It was a lamp. The lamp was old and made of copper, and the glass on one side had been burned through. A name was stamped on the side of the copper: Dane Rowe. Kaizen took the lamp in his hands and held it, unsure of what he was feeling. Erden K said that porters marked lamps with names because they were issued against a signature. He said that such markings were made about 10 years ago and that now the lamp numbers are tracked in the inventory. Haven Lusk looked up the old inventories that same evening. He returned around midnight, his face ashen. He said the lamp had been issued 11 years ago. He said it had been issued to a porter in the training category. He said the porter was listed as discharged that same year. He mentioned 3rd-class rank and named the Lan House office. Kaizen went to the infirmary. His mother was sitting on a cot by the window, mending someone else's shirt, and she was doing it slowly because her hands no longer obeyed her well. He placed the lamp on her lap. Selah Rowe looked at the copper plate. She looked at the name. She set down her needle, covered the lamp with both palms, and held it that way for a long time. Then she said that it was her husband's name. She said her husband had been taken away on a 3rd-class debt 11 years ago. She said her son was 6 at the time. She said that a year after that, her son fell ill and lay feverish for 9 days. She said that on the 10th day, he opened his eyes, and the first thing he said was that the word bone was written above the neighbor's blacksmith shop. Selah Rowe held the lamp on her lap and spoke in an even, uninterrupted voice. She spoke the way people do when they've been repeating something to themselves for 11 years and have been waiting for someone to tell. She said that the debt didn't start with her lungs. It started with water. She said that that year, an old water main burst beneath the lower streets of Den, washing away 2 rows of houses, and their house was in the second row. She said that the house stood on workshop land and that they still had to keep paying for the land even without the house. She said her husband went to the land office because there was nowhere else to go. She said the foreman counted them both, named a figure, and offered an apprentice position. She said her husband agreed that very day and signed up for one spot on his own behalf. She said he left for the cliff a week later and that she saw him only once after that. Kaizen asked if he had been a porter. She said he had. She said he had climbed from the first horizon twice and that on the third time he went up to the second and didn't return. She said that 2 months later, a man from the office knocked on the door and handed her a pay statement for the 3rd grade and a discharge form. She said she hadn't read the form. She said the pay was enough to last 8 months. Then she said the most important thing. She said that a year later, her son fell ill for no apparent reason and ran a fever for 9 days, and that a doctor in the lower streets took her money and told her to wait. She said that on the night of the 9th day, the room grew warm. She said the warmth wasn't coming from the stove. She said they hadn't stoked the stove for 3 weeks by then. She said she sat by her son's side until morning, and that in the morning he opened his eyes and was completely healthy and started talking about the neighbor's blacksmith and the word bone. She said that from that day on, he ceased to be a child. Kaizen listened and put the last piece away. He put it all together calmly because all the pieces were already in place. All that was missing was order. His father went downstairs like a share. Downstairs, they cut away people's limits. The cut-away limits disappear somewhere. A year later, the boy in the city gained someone else's sight and health and paid nothing for it. Kaizen looked at his red line in the dark window pane. Approved for transfer. He told his mother he had to leave, walked out of the infirmary, and stood in the hallway until his hands stopped shaking. He understood a simple thing. The measure was never free. The measure was a transfer. His father couldn't pay the full share and gave up his limit to the lower realm, and part of that limit went up to his son. For 8 years, Kaizen thought he was spending his own ceiling. He was spending his father's. And when he'd spent it down to the last quarter, the account found him on its own and credited him with what was left from his father. 1 share. He returned to the stoneworks warehouse and told this to Earden K and no one else. Earden listened and didn't interrupt. Then he said that if this were true, the boy's name hadn't appeared on an empty page in Garn Lo's records by accident. He said that Kaizen hadn't been purchased into the academy. He said that he'd been added to his father's record. 20 days followed, and they went through 5 phases. The first phase was about abstinence. Kaizen didn't cast a single deep gaze for 19 days in a row. His score remained stuck at 322 and wouldn't budge. He had grown accustomed to not seeing cracks, and this turned out to be harder than he'd thought. He began to misjudge people. Twice he put the wrong person in a tight spot, and both times Vigo Tan took the fall. The second phase was about how he had ceased to be needed. Kaizen gathered the 4 of them after lights out and began teaching them to see without Meryl. He said that a person carries their crack openly and that it can be seen in 3 ways: by where they don't turn, by what they do before a strike, and by whose name silences them. Ocean Kerr was the first to learn because, as a thief, he'd spent his whole life reading people from a distance. Darren Val was the second to learn because he relied on calculation. Len Oyo didn't learn it at all, but he learned to count his opponent's steps aloud, and that turned out to be just as good. Vigo Tan said he didn't need it, and that all he needed to know was where to stand. The third segment was about descents. Over 20 days, the Academy made 11 descents to the first horizon. Not a single one went any lower. Irden K led 9 of them personally. Life flowed upward smoothly, and the city fell silent. Vigo Tan participated in every descent, and on the 8th one, he was appointed Senior Officer of the Bottleneck, a new position invented by Marin Tuk. The 4th segment was about Tevis Sol. Niera kept her brother in the infirmary, and he didn't speak for 3 weeks. He ate when they fed him and stood up when they helped him up. On the 8th day, Terry said that the scar wouldn't heal and that he'd seen this happen to people after collapses. Saren Well disagreed. She sat with him for 2 hours every evening and made him do fine motor work with his hands. She gave him a needle and some canvas. On the 19th day, he picked up the needle on his own without her asking. Niera Sol left the infirmary and went out into the courtyard, where she sat on a rock until dark. This was the only time Kaizen ever saw her sitting down. The 5th flashback was about his mother. Sayla Ro's condition deteriorated steadily, without any sudden changes. She stopped mending clothes on the 12th day. She stopped getting up on the 17th. Azam Terry told Kaizen straight out that her right lung was failing and that the vein from the upper distillery could have given her months, but that the city's reserves had been depleted over the course of 11 dark days. Kaizen went to the lampmakers himself. Reg Olt listened to him while standing in the middle of his distillery. He said that there were 8 measures of the highest grade vein left in Den, and that all 8 had been allocated to the council's medical houses. He said he wouldn't give up a city measure for the mother of a single student. He said he respected what the boy had done in the courtyard. He said that respect and the measure of a vein were 2 different things. He said this without malice, and Kaizen left empty-handed and did not argue because the foreman was right in his own way. The inspector arrived on the 21st day, 19 days ahead of schedule. The mountain chamber controlled all the Empire's failures and issued permits for them, and no one at the Academy had seen its people in 4 years. The inspector's name was Keta Lorne. She was about 40 and arrived with 8 attendants and 2 carts full of papers. She entered the Academy on foot through the gate, and her first stop was not the Council of Masters. She went to the board listing 100 names and read it in its entirety. Then she went to the gate and inspected the bolts and the chain. After that, she sat down at the sealed desk and ordered it to be unsealed, and all the orders from the past 12 years to be presented to her. Haven Lusk presented her with everything on file, including the new uniform. Keta Lorne read through it for 2 days and didn't ask a single question. On the 3rd day, she gathered the Council of Masters, the City Council, and the Guild Elders in the courtyard and announced the Chamber's decision. She spoke calmly and softly, and people listened to her more attentively than they did to those who shouted. She said that the mining chamber acknowledged the violations at the Tyrant Academy. She said that the violations consisted of discrepancies in the dates, the concealment of the side passage, and the abandoned mine. She said that those responsible would be named in a separate document. Then she said something else. She said that the profit-sharing account was not a violation. She said this calmly, as if reading an article. She said that every Empire outpost maintains a share account, and that the Chamber has taken this account into consideration since its founding. She said that the vine doesn't grow on its own. She said that the vine grows where a person has left their mark. She said that the Empire has known this for 200 years, and that this is the foundation of the lighting in all the cities, the medical profession, and half of the crafts. She said that hiding this from the city was a mistake on the part of the Academy, not the Chamber. The court fell silent, just as people do when they've just been told where bread comes from. Keta Lorne announced a new order. Descents to the second horizon will resume in 20 days. Quotas will be standardized, 3 people per descent. Selection is based on voluntary consent, with provisions for the family's future and registration in the chamber's ledger. She said this was the first time in 200 years that the quota would be calculated openly. She said she considered this her victory. Kaizen looked at the faces in the courtyard and saw how it worked. The people heard the words openly, voluntarily, and provisions for the future. Reg Olt was the first to nod. The elders of 2 other guilds nodded after him. The city council voted that same day, 21 votes in favor, 4 against. Niera Sol filed the first objection on the list. Keta Lorne accepted it and said that the first on the list has the right to object, but not the right to decide. Irden K filed an objection on behalf of the head of the dissents. She accepted that one as well. Haven Lusk filed a third objection, and she accepted that one too. That evening, she summoned Kaizen alone. She was sitting at Soren Teed's table, and a single sheet of paper lay before her. She said that the chamber knew about the seers. She said that over the past 200 years, 47 had been recorded, that 4 were currently alive, and that all 4 served the chamber as assessors. She said that an assessor travels through the districts, observes people, and records their limit in the book. She said that the chamber pays well for this, and that the chamber covers the assessor's share. She said she'd seen his entry in Welt Hannah's report, and that she knew about the transfer from Soren Teed. She said that a single share was a trifle for the chamber. She said she'd sign the transfer today, and that the boy would no longer be in debt in an hour. She slid the sheet toward him. Kaizen asked why the chamber needed to know other people's limits. Keta Lorne said that the chamber places people where they are most productive. She said that a person with an ashes limit shouldn't take the place of someone with a steel limit. She said it was simply a matter of efficiency. Kaizen asked what the chamber does with those who have an ashes limit. She didn't answer. He burned through 9 days and looked deeply at her. Step, steel. Lived, order of account. Crack, father. Ceiling, steel. And above it all stood a red line, longer than any he had ever seen. Holder, mountain chamber. Debt, 3,218 shares. Term, indefinite. Kaizen looked at the number and didn't pick up the sheet from the table. 3,218. Keta Lorne was waiting. She was confident in her proposal, and her confidence was genuine. Kaizen told her that the chamber was also in debt. He said the number out loud. The auditor's expression didn't change, and that told him everything. She wasn't surprised. She knew. She said that the chamber had been keeping the tally for 200 years, and that this tally didn't depend on any one person. She said that every appraiser sooner or later asks this question, and that the answer never satisfies them. She said that the empire needs light. She said that in 200 years, no one had figured out how to obtain the vein any other way. She said that whoever breaks the count will extinguish the lamps in all the cities, and that then they'll start counting people in other ways, far worse ones. Kaizen asked whom the chamber owed this to. Keta Lorne said there was no holder. She said that the top line of the chamber's ledger was left blank, and that it had been blank for 200 years. Kaizen took the sheet with the translation, placed it back in front of her, and left. His mother died on the 4th day after that conversation. She died at night, quietly. Saren Well was with her, holding her hand, and didn't call anyone because there was no need to. Kaizen arrived at dawn. Selah Rowe lay still, her face serene, and not a single line stood above her. He looked at the empty space above her and realized that for the first time he was seeing a person without a step and without a limit, and that this was death. He sat with her until noon. Ozum Terry brought water and said nothing. Before that, she had managed to tell him two things. She said that her husband had taken the strap off his neck before leaving and left it for her, and that she had worn it for 11 years. She gave the strap to her son. Hanging from the strap was a flat copper porter's token with a number on it. The second thing she said was without a voice, and he read her lips. She said that her husband had asked her to tell their son one thing. He had asked her to tell him that he had no regrets. She was buried on the third day on the eastern slope, by the wall where a stone stood bearing the 43 names of that descent. Many people came, and Kaizen hadn't expected it. Hoyd Saren came with his apprentices. Dust Morn came. Marin Tuck came. Haven Lask came. Ozum Terry came. Darren Val came. Earden K stood throughout the entire service and did not sit down even once. Niera Sol brought Tavis, and he kept a needle and canvas in his pocket and never let them out. Vigo Tan dug by himself and didn't let anyone else do it. Ocean Kerr didn't come into the courtyard, and Kaizen later found him on the ledge above the eastern wall, where he sat for the entire service, watching from above. He said he didn't know how to stand in a crowd. After the funeral, Kaizen went to Ketalorn and handed her a piece of paper. He submitted an application for a demonstration descent near the city. The auditor read it and said that the provision was outdated and that the first person on the list had already exercised his right this year. Kaizen said he wasn't submitting it as the first person on the list. He submitted it as a debtor to the chamber's ledger and demanded an on-the-spot audit of his account. There was no such provision in the Academy's charter. It was in the chamber's code, and Haven Lask had found it 2 nights earlier in those very same 2 carts of papers that the auditor had brought with her. A debtor had the right to demand that the account be presented to him by the holder in the presence of a chamber accountant. Ketalorn held the paper for a long time. Then she said that in 11 years of service, she had seen only 2 people who had read the chamber codex in its entirety, and both were from the chamber. She signed it. She said she would go down herself because she was the chamber's accountant. The descent was scheduled for the 10th day after the funeral. There were 9 more days, and they passed in 3 stages. The first session concerned the witnesses. Kaizen demanded not a detachment, but the courtyard. The city council refused immediately, and the guild elders followed suit. Then, Earden K found a clause in the regulations governing the ceremonial descent, stating that the hatch must remain open until the team's return, and that while the hatch is open, the throat of the spiral is considered an extension of the Academy's courtyard. Haven Lask wrote a 2-page opinion based on that clause. Ketalorn read it, acknowledged its validity, and recorded it in the chamber minutes. This meant one thing. Anything said within the spiral's throat while the cover was open was considered to have been said within the city. The second segment concerned Rega Alt. The foreman of the lampmakers came to the gates every day for 9 days, demanding that the resumption of the descents be expedited and shouting that the boy was stalling. He said that the veins in the city were 4 measures deep and that soon there would be no burn ointment left in Dain. Kaizen went to see him on the 7th day and did not argue. He offered him a spot on the team. Reg-Olt laughed and asked why a lamplighter would want to go down into the abyss. Kaizen said that he'd been smelting ore for 30 years and had never once seen where it came from. The foreman stopped laughing. He came to the gate on the morning of the descent wearing a work jacket and carrying his own lantern. The third section was about preparation. Len Oyo and Darren Val compiled the second book and listed all 419 names in it by year. Haven Lusk copied them out neatly in triplicate. 1 copy remains with the council. 1 was sent off in the palace wagons. Kaizen took 1 with him in his box. Ocean Kerr spent 2 nights retracing the spiral up to the 142nd turn, checked all the brackets, and replaced the cord with a new one 300 steps long. Saren Well assembled the healer's box according to Ozum Terry's list, and the healer gave her his needle. Vago Tan did not prepare anything. He ate and slept for 10 days straight, as instructed by Marin Took. They descended at noon on the 10th day. The hatch was thrown wide open and secured with struts, and Hoyd Saran stationed 2 of his apprentices at the gate to watch over the struts. The courtyard was full. There were 10 people in the group. Irden K was the leader. Keta Lorne was the chamber's accountant. Kaizan, Vago Tan, Ocean Kerr, Saren Well, Niera Sol. Len Oyo was at the top, count by the lid. Darren Val was with him, holding the second book. Raig Olt was 10th. They passed the first horizon in 3 hours. Raig Olt walked in silence and, halfway up the spiral, stopped by the wall and touched a crack from which resin was oozing. He said he'd been brewing this for 30 years and that he thought it was the stone crying. At 390 turns, the passage opened into a hall. The hall was empty. The lamps didn't reach the ceiling. The floor sloped toward an opening in the center, and from the opening came warmth and an even white light. Boxes stood in rows along the entire slope. There were no longer 300 of them. There were nearly 1,000, and they stood all the way to the farthest walls, and all were full. There wasn't a single person in sight. Len Oyo had stayed upstairs, so there was no one here to count, and Darren Val began counting the rows aloud, but lost count at 400. Raig Olt walked over to the first row, opened a crate, plunged both hands into it, and pulled out a full handful of resin. He stood there with that handful and said nothing. Kaizen told him that the city held 4 measures and that there was a 2-year supply here. He said that the supply had not run out for a single day. Raig Olt asked why they hadn't hauled it out. Kaizen said it was because they hadn't been paid for it. The foreman looked at the empty hall and at the 1,000 crates, then sat down right on the rock and dropped the resin back inside. He said that for 30 years he'd been explaining to the apprentices that the resin was a gift from the rock. He said that he was now 49 years old and that he didn't know how he would step into his distillery tomorrow. Keta Lorne walked along the rows, taking notes. She was keeping an inventory, and she did so precisely. Her hand did not tremble. Then the receiver emerged from the opening. He walked calmly up the slope from below, wearing clean clothes. His face was smooth and well-fed, and Kaizen didn't recognize him at first. Soren Teed stopped 20 paces away. He looked at them one by one and paused on Kaizen, and in his eyes there was nothing of what had been there 20 days ago. There was neither fatigue nor fear. He said that the account was still open. He said that 34 had been accepted, that 1 share had been approved for carryover, and that the debtor had appeared in person, which was correct. He spoke evenly and articulately. It was the speech of a collector, not a human being. Erden K announced the article and demanded that the account be presented to the chamber's accountant. Soren Teed turned to Keta Lorne and told her the amount owed by the Tyrant Academy, the amount owed by the Land House Office, and the amount owed by the Mountain Chamber. He named the figure, 3,218. The auditor recorded and confirmed the figures, which took her less than a minute. Kaizen asked him where Dane Rowe was. The receptionist answered without hesitation. He said that Dane Rowe had been accepted 11 years ago. He said that the limit had been reduced by 1/4 and that 3/4 had been carried over at the request of the initiate. He said that the initiate was working on the 3rd horizon. Kaizen asked what the 3rd horizon was. Soren Teed said it was the place where the ledger was kept. He said the 2nd horizon was the warehouse. He said the 1st was the road. He said the account lay below and that it had been without a holder for 200 years, which was why no one could close it. Keta Lorne looked up from her paper for the first time. Kaizen approached the very edge of the opening. A warm draft wafted from within, and the light was even and white, containing neither fire nor veins. He looked down and burned 9 days. Beneath him, a red line unfurled across the entire depth of the shaft. It was enormous and stood neither above the man nor above the paper. It stood above the abyss itself. Holder. The field was empty. Debt, 4,961 shares. Term, indefinite. And beneath it all stood the final line, which Kaizen had never seen before. The bill may be presented to the holder. No holder has been designated.